Blood is notoriously difficult to wash out of worn denim. This is a fact that 17-year-old Jessamine Whitlow learned at exactly 2:14 in the morning on a suffocating August night in the Nevada desert. She was no hero. She had never claimed to be one. She was just a girl working the graveyard shift at a decaying Texaco gas station on Route 11, trying to earn enough cash to keep the lights on in her mother's house and the prescription bottles full on her mother's nightstand. But when three desperate men cornered a terrified girl by the air pumps, a girl wearing the unmistakable colors of an outlaw motorcycle club, Jess made a split-second decision that would paint the cracked asphalt red with her own blood. By dawn, 200 roaring engines would shake the forgotten town of Ridgestone, Nevada to its absolute foundations. And nothing in that dried-up, dust-choked stretch of highway would ever be the same again. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand the weight of what happened that night, you first have to understand the girl behind the counter. And to understand her, you have to understand her mother. 48 hours before the blood, before the knife, before the thunder of 200 V-twin engines split the desert silence wide open, the world was painfully ordinary. Tuesday afternoon, 4:17 p.m. The temperature gauge nailed to the rotting porch of the Whitlow house read 109 degrees. The wood was so warped by decades of relentless sun that the numbers had faded to ghosts. But nobody in Ridgestone needed a thermometer to know the heat. You felt it in your teeth. You felt it in the way the air sat on your chest like a wet wool blanket, pressing the breath right out of you. Jessamine Whitlow stood in the narrow kitchen of the single-story clapboard house she shared with her mother on the eastern fringe of town. The house was old.
Not charmingly old, not antique store old, but tired old, defeated old. The kind of old that whispered about unpaid repair bills and second mortgages and slow grinding surrender. The linoleum was peeling near the refrigerator. The faucet dripped a steady, maddening rhythm into a stained porcelain sink. The ceiling fan wobbled on every third rotation with a faint clicking sound that Jess had long ago stopped hearing. She was tall for her age, wiry but strong with lean, ropey muscles built not in a gym, but from years of hauling scrap metal, stacking tires, and dragging engine blocks across the dirt lot of Mercer's salvage yard on the south end of town. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight, practical ponytail. Her hands scrubbing a cast-iron skillet under the lukewarm tap water were calloused and nicked with small white scars. They were not the hands of a 17-year-old girl. They were the hands of someone who had been working since she was old enough to lift.
The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon. It always smelled like cinnamon when her mother was having a good day. Dorothea Whitlow sat at the small kitchen table, a half-finished batch of snickerdoodle dough, resting in a ceramic bowl in front of her. She was 53 years old. But the congestive heart failure that had been slowly tightening its grip on her chest for the past 4 years had aged her cruelly. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched thin over sharp cheekbones. Her breathing carried a faint, wet rattle that Jess had learned to monitor the way a sailor monitors the wind. On bad days, the rattle deepened into a heavy, labored wheeze, and Jess would sit beside her bed all night, counting the seconds between each breath, terrified that one of the gaps would simply stretch out into forever. Today was not a bad day. Today, Dorothea had gotten out of bed before noon.
She had shuffled to the kitchen in her worn terry cloth robe and her old nursing clogs, the ones she used to wear during 12-hour shifts at the county hospital before her heart decided to betray her. She had pulled the flour and sugar from the cupboard with trembling hands, and she had started mixing dough. It was such a small thing, such an ordinary, unremarkable thing. A woman baking cookies in her own kitchen. But Jess had stood in the doorway and watched her mother's thin, shaking fingers press the dough into balls, and she had felt something crack open in her chest, because good days were becoming rarer. The gaps between them were widening, and Jess understood with the quiet, unflinching clarity of a girl who had grown up too fast that each good day might be the last one. She never said this out loud. She never had to. Dorothea rolled a ball of dough between her palms, her movements slow and deliberate.
She paused, resting her wrist on the edge of the bowl, catching her breath from the effort of such a tiny motion. "You're hovering again," Dorothea said without looking up. Her voice was thin but warm, carrying the faintest trace of the sharp, capable woman she had been before the disease. She had spent 22 years as a registered nurse at the Ridgestone County Medical Center before her own heart had put her on the other side of the bed rail. She knew the look of someone monitoring vital signs. "I'm doing dishes," Jess replied, keeping her voice light. "That's not hovering. That's being a responsible member of the household." "You're counting my breaths again." Jess paused the skillet halfway to the drying rack. A faint smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Maybe." Dorothea looked up. Her eyes, despite the exhaustion that permanently shadowed them, were sharp and clear. Blue-gray like winter sky before a storm, the same eyes she had given her daughter. "I'm fine today, Jessamine." "I know." "Then stop looking at me like I'm a cracked egg you're afraid to pick up." Jess set the skillet down and dried her hands on a threadbare towel. She walked to the table, pulling out the chair across from her mother and sitting down. She reached into the bowl, pinched off a piece of raw dough, and popped it in her mouth. "You'll get salmonella." Dorothea warned the familiar reflex of a nurse overriding the fatigue. "I've been eating your raw cookie dough since I was 6. If salmonella was going to get me, it would have done it by now." Dorothea let out a breath that was almost a laugh. She pushed the bowl closer to her daughter. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The ceiling fan clicked on its third rotation. The faucet dripped. Outside, the relentless Nevada sun hammered the cracked earth, and the only sound was the distant hum of a semi-truck on the interstate miles away. "The pharmacy called," Dorothea said quietly. The air in the kitchen changed instantly. Jess felt it the same way she felt the barometric pressure drop before a desert thunderstorm. A subtle tightening, a shift in weight. "They said they can't extend the credit on the Entresto anymore." Dorothea continued, her eyes dropping to the table. "Insurance denied the refill again. Something about prior authorization expiring." She said the words with practiced clinical detachment, as though she were reading someone else's chart. But her fingers resting on the edge of the ceramic bowl curled slightly inward. Jess kept her face perfectly still. She had become very good at this, at absorbing the blows without flinching, at letting the panic detonate somewhere deep inside her chest, where it couldn't reach her expression. The Entresto was the cornerstone of her mother's medication regimen. Without it, the fluid would start building around her heart within weeks. And then the emergency room visits would start again. And then the bills would start multiplying like cancer cells. And then the fragile, exhausting balance they had maintained for the past 2 years would collapse entirely. "How much?" Jess asked. $512 for a 30-day supply." "Okay." "It's not okay, Jessamine." "I said okay. That means I'll figure it out." Dorothea's jaw tightened. "You're 17 years old. You work 2 jobs. You have school starting in 3 weeks. You are not responsible for figuring this out." Jess looked at her mother, really looked at her, at the woman who had raised her alone after Jess's father had driven his pickup truck into a concrete barrier on Interstate 80 when Jess was 4 years old. At the woman who had worked double shifts, holidays, weekends, pulling 12-hour overnight rotations at the hospital to keep a roof over their heads. At the woman who had taught her to change a tire, to suture a wound with a sewing needle and dental floss, to stand up straight when the world was trying to push her down. At the woman who was now too weak to finish rolling a ball of cookie dough. "You taught me something," Jess said, her voice steady. "You probably don't even remember saying it. I was maybe 10. You came home from a shift and you were exhausted, and I asked you why you kept going back when the work was so hard. And you sat right there, right in that chair, and you said, 'Jessamine, you don't ever turn your back when somebody needs you, even when it cost you, especially when it cost you.'" Dorothea's eyes glistened. She opened her mouth, then closed it. "So that's what I'm doing," Jess said simply. "You need me, so I figure it out." She stood, pushing the chair back. She kissed her mother on the forehead, tasting the faint salt of sweat and the powdery sweetness of flour dust. She grabbed her denim jacket from the hook by the back door. "I've got the overnight at the Texaco tonight," Jess said. "Hank's paying time and a half for the graveyard shift because nobody else will take it. I'll pick up the prescription tomorrow morning. 5:12. I'll have it." She didn't have it. She had $187 in a mason jar under her bed and another 42 in a checking account at the credit union. But she said the words with the same unshakable conviction her mother had used for 22 years of nursing the kind of voice that made patients believe they were going to be fine, even when the monitors said otherwise. "I love you, baby," Dorothea called after her. "Love you too, Mom. Don't eat all the dough before I get back." The screen door banged shut behind her. The dry desert heat wrapped around her like a fist. She walked to the rusted Dodge Dakota parked in the dirt driveway, climbed in and sat behind the wheel for exactly 12 seconds with her eyes closed. Then she opened them, turned the key, and drove to work. The drive to the Texaco station took 14 minutes. Route 11 was a two-lane blacktop that cut through the gut of the Nevada desert like a faded surgical scar. There was nothing on either side of it except sagebrush alkali dust and the occasional sun-bleached carcass of a coyote that had misjudged the speed of a passing truck. Ridgestone itself was barely a town. It was more of an afterthought, a cluster of low-slung buildings that had calcified around a single intersection sometime in the 1950s and never bothered to grow. Population 800 and something, depending on who had died or decamped for Reno since the last census. There was a diner, a hardware store, a Baptist church with a steeple that leaned 11 degrees to the east, and the Texaco station on Route 11, which served as the town's unofficial northern border. Beyond the Texaco, there was nothing. Just open desert stretching to the horizon, flat and featureless as a dead man's electrocardiogram. Jess pulled into the station lot at 9:47 p.m. The previous shift attendant, a heavy-set man named Dale, who smelled permanently of menthol cigarettes, grunted a greeting, tossed her the keys, and disappeared into the night without looking back. The fluorescent lights inside the station buzzed with a dying erratic rhythm, casting a pale, sickly glow over the aisles of beef jerky, motor oil, and discount sunglasses. Jess locked the register, checked the slushy machine, and settled behind the chipped formica counter with her battered algebra textbook. She had a placement test in 3 weeks. If she scored high enough, she could skip remedial math at the community college in Sparks and go straight into a course that would actually count toward a degree. It was a small thing. But small things were the only kind of progress available to a girl in Ridgestone, Nevada, and Jess collected them the way a prospector collects flakes of gold. Tiny, precious, easily lost. The hours passed with agonizing slowness. 11 o'clock, midnight, 1 a.m. The only customers were a long-haul trucker who bought a 44-ounce Mountain Dew and a pack of no-dos and an elderly couple in an RV who used the restroom and left without purchasing anything. Jess's eyes drifted from the textbook. She stared at the equations, but the numbers blurred into the fluorescent haze. Her mind kept circling back to the pharmacy. $512. She could pick up extra shifts at the salvage yard. She could sell the small television in the living rooms. She could ask Hank for an advance on next week's pay. She would figure it out. She always figured it out. The clock on the wall behind the register read 1:58 a.m., 16 minutes before everything changed. Now, to understand what walked through the door of the Texaco station that night, you have to understand the war that had been quietly bleeding the county dry for months. 23 miles southeast of Ridgestone, on a stretch of desert highway that didn't appear on most commercial maps, sat a sprawling compound of corrugated metal buildings, rusted shipping containers, and chain link fencing, topped with razor wire. This was Harmon's salvage and recovery. And despite what the faded sign suggested, very little salvaging or recovering of legitimate goods took place there. Wade Harmon ran the operation. He was 44 years old, built like a fence post, lean and hard, and weathered by decades of desert sun and bad decisions. His head was shaved clean, and a thick scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. The souvenir of a knife fight in a Reno bar parking lot 12 years ago. His eyes were the color of dirty ice, pale and flat and completely devoid of warmth. Wade was a man who had been circling the drain his entire adult life. He dealt in stolen auto parts, moved methamphetamine through a network of couriers that stretched from Ridgestone to the California border, and operated a fencing operation that turned stolen goods into untraceable cash. He was violent when violence was profitable, and he was cruel when cruelty was convenient. But he was not stupid. Stupid men didn't survive 20 years in the desert underworld. What Wade was at this particular moment in his rapidly deteriorating life was desperate. 5 years ago, he had been a patched member of the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club. He had worn the snarling wolf emblem on his back with genuine pride. He had ridden with brothers who would bleed for him, who would stand shoulder to shoulder against any threat. He had belonged to something larger than himself, and for a man who had grown up in a succession of foster homes and juvenile detention centers, that belonging had been the only real thing he had ever known. Then Hollis Kincaid had taken it away. Hollis Iron Kincaid, president of the Iron Wolves, a man whose name was spoken in the Tri-County area the way ancient people spoke the names of gods they didn't want to anger. Wade had made the mistake of running a side operation moving product through the Iron Wolves territory without the club's sanction. It was a violation of the most fundamental law of the brotherhood. When Hollis found out, there was no trial, no appeal, no second chance. Wade was stripped of his patch in front of the full chapter. His cut was taken from his back. His tattoos were marked for removal. He was escorted to the county line by 6 enforcers and told that if he ever wore the wolf again, they would bury him in the desert with his mouth full of sand. The humiliation had been total, absolute. The kind of wound that doesn't heal. It festers. It rots inward. It turns a broken man into a dangerous one. For 5 years, Wade had rebuilt his operation from the scrapyard, nursing his hatred of Hollis Kincaid the way a man nurses a coal fire in winter. Every deal he made, every dollar he stacked, every ounce of product he moved through the desert brought him one step closer to a reckoning he had been dreaming about since the night they took his patch. But 3 months ago, the dream curdled into a nightmare. The cartel contact who supplied Wade's methamphetamine operation had called in a debt. Not a small debt. A $200,000 debt that Wade had accumulated over 18 months of deferred payments and broken promises. The man on the phone had been very polite, very calm. He had explained in precise and courteous language that Wade had 14 days to deliver the full amount, or representatives of the organization would visit Ridgestone to collect the balance in a different currency. Wade understood what that meant. He had seen the currency they collected from men who couldn't pay. It was measured in fingers and teeth and shallow graves. He had tried everything. He had liquidated inventory. He had called in every outstanding favor. He had squeezed his network until it bled. But the desert was dry and the money was short, and the deadline was close enough now that Wade could feel it pressing against his throat like a dull blade. That was when the idea had taken root. Not a good idea, not a smart idea. The kind of idea that only grows in the toxic soil of desperation. Hollis Kincaid had a daughter, a 16-year-old girl named Wren. She was the president's only child, his blood. The single point of vulnerability in an otherwise impenetrable fortress of muscle iron and tribal loyalty. If Wade could take the girl, he could force Hollis to pay the cartel debt as ransom. 200,000 was pocket change for a club that controlled smuggling routes across 3 state lines. Hollis would pay without blinking. It was kidnapping. It was a death sentence if it went wrong. But Wade was already looking at a death sentence from the cartel, so the math in his desperate and deteriorating mind made a terrible kind of sense. He had spent 2 weeks watching the Kincaid compound. He had tracked the girl's movements. He had identified a weakness. Every Thursday night, Wren was driven to a music lesson in Hawthorne by her uncle Brennan Kincaid, Hollis's younger brother. The route took them along a desolate stretch of back road that passed through an unincorporated patch of scrubland with no cell coverage and no witnesses. Tonight was Thursday. Wade had assembled his crew. Boone, a massive man with a shaved head and hands the size of dinner plates, who served as Wade's primary enforcer. And Greer, a wiry, twitchy man with decaying teeth and darting eyes who everyone called Twitchy, because he couldn't hold still for more than 3 seconds. They weren't smart, they weren't brave, but they were available and they owed Wade money, and they were afraid enough of the cartel's reputation to agree to something they would have otherwise refused. The plan was simple: intercept the car on the back road, take the girl, deliver the ransom demand, collect the money, disappear. Simple plans are the ones that go wrong in the most spectacular ways. The ambush happened at 11:42 p.m. Brennan Kincaid's silver Ford Explorer was traveling westbound on County Road 7 at approximately 55 miles per hour. The road was empty. The moon was half full, casting a pale skeletal light across the scrubland. Wren Kincaid sat in the passenger seat, her boots on the dashboard, scrolling through a playlist on her phone. She was 16, dark hair in a tangled ponytail, her father's stubborn jaw. She wore an oversized leather vest over a plain black t-shirt, the snarling wolf patch of the Iron Wolves prominent on the back. The vest was too big for her, obviously borrowed from a full-grown man, and it swallowed her small frame. But she wore it every time she left the compound. It was armor, identity, a declaration. Brennan, a stocky man in his late 40s with a thick gray beard and kind eyes, was talking about the Reno rodeo. He was mid-sentence when the headlights of a battered matte black Dodge Ram appeared in the oncoming lane, swerved violently across the center line, and slammed into the front driver's side of the Explorer at an oblique angle. The impact was catastrophic. The Explorer spun 180 degrees, its tires screaming against the asphalt before the vehicle slid off the road and into a shallow ditch. The airbags deployed with a deafening crack. Dust and glass filled the cabin. Wren's ears were ringing. She tasted blood. Her left wrist throbbed violently where it had slammed against the dashboard. Through the shattered windshield, she saw the Dodge Ram backing up, its front bumper crushed, but its engine still running. 3 figures climbed out. Brennan was slumped in the driver's seat, blood pouring from a deep gash above his left eye. He was conscious but stunned. He reached under the seat with a trembling hand, searching for something. "Wren!" Brennan grunted, his voice thick and slurred. "The gun under my seat. Give it to me." Wren's hands were shaking violently. She unbuckled her seatbelt and reached under the driver's seat. Her fingers found cold metal. She pulled out a heavy black revolver and pressed it into her uncle's bloody hand. Brennan pushed his door open. It groaned against the bent frame. He stumbled out of the vehicle, raising the revolver with both hands. He got off one shot. The crack of the gunfire split the desert silence like a thunderclap. The bullet punched a hole in the Dodge Ram's passenger door. Then Boone was on him. The massive enforcer tackled Brennan from the blind side, driving him into the dirt. The revolver went flying. There was a brief, vicious struggle, a tangle of limbs and grunting, and the dull, heavy sound of fists connecting with bone. Wren heard her uncle scream her name one last time. Then Wade Harmon stepped into view. He stood over the 2 struggling men on the ground, and without a word he drew a serrated hunting knife from his belt and ended Brennan Kincaid's fight permanently. The desert went silent. Wren's body moved before her mind could catch up. Survival instinct raw and ancient overrode the horror. She kicked open the passenger door of the Explorer, tumbled into the ditch, and ran. She ran north, away from the road, into the open desert. The oversized leather vest slapped against her thighs. The sagebrush tore at her jeans. She could hear shouting behind her, the heavy crunch of boots on gravel, but she didn't look back. She ran with the desperate, mindless speed of a rabbit flushed from a hole, and the desert for once was her ally. The terrain was broken and uneven, riddled with shallow washes and low ridges that provided just enough cover in the moonlight. Wade screamed after her. His voice carried across the empty expanse, ugly and raw. But Wren was young and fast, and fueled by a terror that made her legs pump like pistons. She widened the gap. The shouting faded. She heard the Dodge Ram's engine roar to life, but the vehicle couldn't follow her off-road through the broken scrubland. She ran for 47 minutes, nearly 3 miles through open desert in the dark. Her lungs burned, her wrists screamed, her boots were shredded. But ahead of her, rising from the flat horizon like a mirage, she saw the pale glow of fluorescent lights. The Texaco station on Route 11. She staggered across the parking lot, her chest heaving, her dark hair a tangled, sweat-soaked mess. She pushed through the glass door so violently that the bell above the frame didn't just chime. It clanged, a harsh, desperate sound. Jess Whitlow looked up from her algebra textbook. The girl standing in the harsh artificial light of the Texaco station looked like she had crawled out of a car wreck and then sprinted through a war zone. She was maybe 16, breathing in ragged, hitching gasps. Her left wrist was swollen and held protectively against her chest. Her face was smeared with dirt and blood, though the blood didn't appear to be hers. And she wore a heavy, oversized leather vest that hung past her hips, the snarling wolf emblem of the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club plainly visible on the back, partially obscured by a fresh tear in the hide. Jess straightened up behind the counter, instantly alert, every nerve in her body shifting from drowsy boredom to full crackling awareness. Everyone in the Tri-County area knew about the Iron Wolves. They were not a weekend riding club for dentists and accountants. They were an institution, a brutal, ancient brotherhood bound by blood oaths and enforced by violence, ruled by a man known across 3 states simply as Iron. Jess kept her hands visible on the counter. She kept her voice low and calm, the way her mother had taught her to speak to patients in crisis. "Hey, you okay? You need to use the phone." Wren. Kincaid's eyes darted frantically toward the windows. Her entire body was trembling, not from cold, but from the sustained corrosive effect of adrenaline flooding a young nervous system far past its breaking point. She looked at Jess, really looked at her, at the calm eyes and the steady hands, and the girl behind the counter, who didn't look like she was about to scream or run. "Lock the door!" Wren gasped, her voice cracking like dry wood. "Please, just lock it." Before Jess could process the request, she heard it. The crunch of gravel outside. It was a heavy, grinding sound, the kind made by a large vehicle moving too fast across an unpaved surface. Headlights swept across the front windows of the Texaco station, throwing long, harsh shadows across the aisles. A battered, matte black Dodge Ram, with a crushed front bumper, skidded to a halt parallel to the gas pumps, kicking up a cloud of alkali dust that swirled in the yellow overhead lights like a dirty snowstorm. Wren whimpered, a small, involuntary sound that came from somewhere deeper than thought. She dropped below the level of the window displays, curling into a tight ball behind a cardboard stand of discount sunglasses near the base of the counter. Jess watched through the glass as 3 men climbed out of the truck. She recognized the driver immediately. Wade Harmon. Everyone in Ridgestone knew Wade. Not personally, not socially. They knew him the way people know a rattlesnake den on their property. You know where it is. You stay away from it. You warn your children. Wade ran his operation out of the scrapyard near the county line, and his reputation preceded him like the smell of smoke precedes a wildfire. Broken teeth, burned out trailers. People who crossed him and then simply stopped appearing in town. The 2 men with him were equally familiar by reputation. Boone, the massive enforcer with the shaved head, was cradling his right hand against his chest. Something dark stained the front of his shirt. And Twitchy Greer, wiry and jumpy, was pacing behind Wade with the nervous energy of a caged animal. Wade adjusted his belt. A heavy brass buckle caught the fluorescent light. He walked toward the glass door with the unhurried predatory stride of a man who was accustomed to doors opening for him. He didn't knock. He yanked the door open. The bell jingled a cheerful, mocking tune that was absurdly at odds with the violence radiating from his body. "Evening, sweetheart," Wade drawled. His voice was like gravel grinding in a cement mixer, rough and abrasive, and flecked with something oily. He didn't look at Jess. His eyes were already sweeping the aisles of the small convenience store, scanning the shelves, the corners, the shadows. "We saw a little stray dog wander in here." Wade continued his gaze, methodically working through the store. "Wearing an oversized collar. You seen her?" Jess felt her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was certain it was visible through her shirt. She could feel the adrenaline surging through her system, sharpening her senses to a razor point. She was acutely aware of three things simultaneously. The girl curled in a ball behind the sunglasses stand 3 feet to her left. The heavy steel tire iron sitting under the counter right next to the panic button that had been broken since 1998. And the hunting knife on Wade Harmon's belt, its handle dark with something that looked very much like blood. Brennan Kincaid's blood, though Jess didn't know that yet. She looked at Wade. She kept her expression flat, bored. The expression of a teenage girl working a dead-end job at 2 in the morning who couldn't care less about anything except getting through her shift. "Nobody here but me, Mr. Harmon," Jess said. Her voice was surprisingly steady. She closed her algebra textbook with a casual motion, as though the conversation were an interruption to something far more important. "Just trying to get through a shift." Boone scoffed. He kicked over a display of motor oil near the entrance. The plastic bottles clattered and rolled across the linoleum floor in a chaotic scatter. "Don't lie to us." Boone snarled, his voice tight with pain from whatever injury he was nursing. "We tracked her from the county line. Kincaid's kid, Iron's precious little daughter. She's our insurance policy, and she walked right into this dump." Jess's blood ran cold. Iron's daughter. The full weight of the situation slammed into her chest like a physical blow. The Iron Wolves and Wade's crew had been locked in a bloody territorial war for months, fighting over smuggling routes through the desert. If Wade got hold of this girl, it wouldn't just be leverage. It would be a death sentence. For the girl. And eventually, inevitably, for anyone who had seen it happen. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jess said again, shifting her weight slightly to the left to better block their line of sight toward the sunglasses display. "If you guys want a coffee, it's fresh. Otherwise, I've got to ask you to leave. I'm supposed to close up soon." Twitchy Greer, who had been prowling the aisles with his darting, restless eyes, suddenly stopped. A grin spread across his face, exposing a row of decaying teeth that looked like broken headstones. He pointed a dirt-stained finger toward the floor behind the counter. "Look at the dust, Wade. Little footprints. Right there." Jess's stomach dropped. Wade's eyes narrowed. He reached for his belt and drew the serrated hunting knife. The blade caught the fluorescent light, and Jess could see it clearly now. The dark residue along the edge. The way it was still slightly wet. "Kid," Wade said. His tone dropped all pretense of civility. It became flat, mechanical, the voice of a man who had made a calculation and arrived at a number. "Step aside. You're making minimum wage. You don't get paid enough to die tonight." Time seemed to slow. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their erratic flicker, casting microshadows that danced across the shelves. The slushy machine hummed. The faucet in the back sink dripped. And Jessamine Whitlow stood behind the counter of a gas station in a town that nobody cared about, staring at a man with a bloody knife who was telling her in perfectly clear terms that she could walk away. She looked at the knife, then at Wade's flat, dead, unblinking eyes. She knew she was outmatched. She was a 17-year-old girl with a decent arm and a good work ethic. These were killers, real killers, the kind who left bodies in ditches and slept soundly afterward. But then she looked down. Ren Kincaid was curled behind the sunglasses. Stand, her knees pulled to her chest, her face pressed into her hands, sobbing silently. She was 16 years old. She was wearing a dead man's blood on her clothes, and she was looking up at Jess with wide, desperate, pleading eyes that held a single raw question. Are you going to give me to them? Jess thought about her mother sitting at the kitchen table, rolling snickerdoodle-dough with trembling hands. She thought about the words Dorothea had spoken so many times. They had become part of the architecture of Jess's bones. You don't ever turn your back when somebody needs you. She thought about what kind of person she wanted to be when she looked in the mirror tomorrow morning. I said. Jess repeated, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the edge of the counter. She's not here. Wade sighed, a sound of genuine irritation like a man swatting at a persistent fly. He nodded to Boone. Move her. Boone lunged forward despite his injured hand. He was easily 250 pounds of muscle and bad intentions. He reached across the counter to grab Jess by the collar of her work shirt. Jess didn't freeze. Instinct took over. The same instinct that had been honed by years of hauling sharp metal and dodging falling engine blocks at the salvage yard. Her left hand dropped below the counter, closed around the heavy steel tire iron, and swung it in a vicious upward arc. The heavy metal connected with Boone's forearm with a crack that echoed through the small store like a gunshot. Bones snapped. Boone bellowed in agony, stumbling backward, clutching his newly shattered arm against his massive chest. Get her! Wade roared. Twitchy Greer vaulted over the counter, his boots kicking the register and sending coins flying in a metallic shower. Jess swung the tire iron again, catching Greer hard in the ribs. She heard something crack, but Greer was wired on adrenaline and probably something chemical, and he tackled her around the waist, driving them both into the back shelving unit. Bags of chips and candy rained down on them. Run! Jess screamed, her voice tearing through the chaos. Go out the back now! Wren scrambled to her feet. Her boots slipped on the spilled motor oil. She caught her balance and bolted toward the heavy steel door at the back of the store, the one that led to the old mechanic's garage. Wade saw her moving. Get the girl! He shouted, stepping over the writhing Boone and charging past the counter. Jess threw Greer off with a desperate heave, adrenaline flooding every muscle fiber in her body. She scrambled to her feet, chips crunching under her boots, and threw herself directly between Wade Harmon and the retreating girl. Get out of the way, kid! Wade snarled, thrusting the hunting knife forward. Jess brought the tire iron up to block, but the space was too cramped. The shelving units pressed in from both sides. There was nowhere to pivot, nowhere to dodge. She felt a sudden, heavy punch in her left side just below her ribs. There was no immediate pain, just a shocking alien coldness that bloomed outward from the point of impact, followed instantly by a sickening wet heat. Wade ripped the blade out. Jess gasped. The air rushed from her lungs as though someone had opened a valve. She stumbled backward, her shoulders hitting the wall. The tire iron slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. Her right hand flew instinctively to her side. Dark, thick blood was already pulsing through her fingers, soaking her faded blue Texaco uniform shirt in a spreading warm stain. Wren, halfway through the heavy steel door of the garage, turned back. She saw Jess sliding down the wall, leaving a broad crimson smear on the white paint. She screamed, a raw, ragged sound that bounced off the cinder block walls and echoed into the garage beyond. Wade took another step toward Jess, raising the bloody knife to finish what he had started. But Boone, still clutching his shattered arm, had staggered to the front window. His face was contorted in pain, but his eyes were sharp with a different kind of fear. Wade, sirens! State troopers coming down the highway! Wade froze, his jaw clenched. He looked at Jess, who was now sitting on the floor in a growing pool of her own blood, her head beginning to loll to the side. He looked at Wren, who was standing in the garage doorway, tears streaming down her face, holding the heavy steel door open with both hands. The tactical calculation recalibrated in Wade's mind. A stabbed gas station attendant was one thing. Getting caught standing over her body by state police was another. "This isn't over," Wade spat. "We'll be back for her, and the girl bleeds out before sunrise." The three men scrambled out of the store, leaving a trail of bloody boot prints on the linoleum. Seconds later, the Dodge Ram tore out of the parking lot, its tires screaming against the asphalt. The sirens Wade's man had heard were just a passing ambulance on the interstate, heading somewhere else, responding to someone else's emergency. The wailing faded into the distance like a broken promise. They were completely alone. Wren rushed back into the store, dropping to her knees beside Jess. The floor was slick with blood. So much blood. It was spreading outward in a dark creeping tide that seemed impossibly large for something coming from a single body. "Oh my God," Wren choked. "Oh my God, you're bleeding. You're bleeding so much." She pressed her small, trembling hands over Jess's, adding pressure to the wound. Jess coughed. A metallic taste coated her tongue. Her vision was already beginning to blur at the edges, the fluorescent light smearing into soft golden halos. "Lock the door," Jess whispered, her voice incredibly weak. "The big metal one?" Wren understood. She grabbed Jess under the arms and dragged her, leaving a horrific smeared trail of red across the linoleum through the heavy steel door and into the back mechanic's bay. It was dark. It smelled of old rubber gasoline and stale grease. A hydraulic lift sat in the center, and an oil-changing pit was cut into the concrete floor beneath it. Wren slammed the heavy steel door shut and threw the deadbolt. The clang echoed through the concrete chamber like the closing of a vault. "I'm going to call an ambulance," Wren cried, pulling a battered smartphone from her jeans pocket with blood-slicked fingers. "No!" Jess breathed. Her head was resting against a stack of discarded tires. The cold of the rubber was almost soothing against her overheated skin. "Wade has a police scanner. He pays off the local dispatch. If you call 911, his guys will be waiting at the hospital doors. They'll intercept us, finish us both." Wren stared at her. The horror in her young face deepened as the full scope of the corruption in Ridgestone registered. The town wasn't just neglected. It was owned. The dispatch, the local police, the emergency response chain, all of it ran through channels that Wade Harmon had spent years contaminating. "Then what do I do?" Wren begged. Her hands were slick with Jess's blood trembling violently, but she kept the pressure on the wound. She didn't let go. "You're dying. You saved me, and you're dying." "Call your dad," Jess managed. Her eyelids fluttered. The pain was arriving now. Not the sharp, clean pain of the initial wound, but a deep, searing, white-hot agony that radiated outward from her side in pulsing waves, each one synchronized with her fading heartbeat. It threatened to drag her under like an undertow. Wren hesitated for only a fraction of a second. She unlocked her phone. Her fingers left red smears on the cracked screen. She dialed a number she knew by heart. It rang once, twice. A deep, gravelly voice answered. "Yeah, Dad," Wren sobbed. The word came out broken, shattered into pieces by the force of everything she had been holding back. "Dad, it's me." The voice on the other end shifted instantly. The casual rumble vanished, replaced by something hard and sharp and lethally focused. "Wren, where are you?" "The boys have been tearing the county apart looking for Brennan's truck. I'm at the Texaco station on Route 11, just north of Ridgestone." Wren's words stumbled over each other, wet with tears and panic. "Wade Harmon's guys found me. They hit Uncle Brennan's car. That Uncle Brennan, I think he's gone. They came after me." A heavy silence. The kind of silence that has weight, that presses against the walls. "Did they touch you?" Hollis Kincaid asked. His voice was quiet, deathly quiet, the kind of quiet that comes just before the worst storms. "No," Wren cried. She looked down at Jess, whose breathing was becoming shallow and ragged. each exhale carrying a faint wet rattle that Wren recognized from a place deeper than knowledge. No, but there's a girl here. The girl working the counter. Dad, she fought them. She grabbed a tire iron and she fought all three of them. She stood in front of me. She wouldn't move. Wren's voice broke completely. Dad, Wade stabbed her. She's bleeding out. There's so much blood. We can't call an ambulance because Wade owns the dispatch. You have to come. Please. You have to come now. Another beat of silence. Then a sound traveled through the phone that made every hair on Wren Kincaid's body stand on end. It was the sound of a heavy leather jacket being zipped up, followed by the deep mechanical growl of a motorcycle engine turning over. Then another engine, and another, a rising chorus of thunder that built and built until it filled the phone's tiny speaker with a wall of raw mechanical fury. Through the phone, Wren could hear Hollis barking orders. She couldn't make out the words, but she recognized the tone. It was the voice he used when there was no room for questions. The voice that sent 200 men reaching for their keys and their leather and their boots without asking why. She heard the compound coming alive around him, distant shouts and the clang of metal and engine after engine roaring to life, the sound building and layering until it became a sustained mechanical roar that saturated the phone's tiny speaker. Hold the pressure on her wound, sweetheart. Hollis Kincaid's voice came through the phone with a terrifying absolute authority. The voice of a man who had commanded violent men for 30 years and had never once had an order questioned. Tell that girl to hold on. We are 40 minutes out. I have to rally the full chapter from 3 locations. But we are coming, and we are bringing everyone. The line went dead. Wren dropped the phone. It clattered against the oil-stained concrete. She leaned over Jess, pressing her entire body weight against the wound in Jess's side, feeling the warm wet blood soaking through the mechanic's rags and into her own clothes. Stay with me. Wren pleaded, her tears falling onto Jess's pale gray face. My dad is coming. Do you hear me? You just have to hold on. Jess's eyes were half closed. Her breathing was thin, shallow, each inhale a fragile, papery sound. The fluorescent light that leaked under the steel door cast a thin blue line across the concrete floor, and in the darkness of the mechanic's bay, surrounded by the smell of gasoline and rubber and blood, the 2 girls huddled together against the cold. Outside, the desert remained silent and still. The stars burned overhead with indifferent brilliance. The wind carried nothing but dust. But 40 miles away, across 3 separate locations scattered through the desert, a storm was building. Riders were being woken by phone calls. Kickstands were being kicked up. Throttles were being twisted. At the main compound at the clubhouse in Fallon and at the safe house near the state line, men pulled on boots and leather and converged on Route 11 from 3 directions, merging into a single massive formation that grew larger with every mile. A rolling wave of iron leather and vengeance was preparing to descend upon Ridgestone. And the night was far from over. The specific kind of cold that blood loss introduces to the human body does not arrive all at once. It does not slam into you the way a winter gust hits your face when you step outside. It creeps. It starts in the fingertips and toes, a slow, patient, icy tide that works its way inward with methodical precision, systematically shutting down the extremities as the heart desperately hoards whatever warmth remains for the vital organs. The brain, the lungs, the stubborn failing pump itself. Jessamine Whitlow lay on the oil-stained concrete floor of the Texaco garage, feeling that frozen tide pulling her under inch by inch. The darkness around her was thick and close, smelling strongly of old rubber-stale gasoline and the sharp copper tang of her own blood. The only light came from a thin blue line leaking under the heavy steel door that separated the garage from the convenience store, and the faint red glow of a digital clock mounted high on the far wall, half obscured by a hanging fan belt. 2:27 a.m., 13 minutes since the knife. It felt like hours. Keep your eyes open. Wren Kincaid's voice cut through the fog. It was shaking. trembling with fear and exhaustion, and the sustained corrosive weight of holding another person's life in your hands when you are 16 years old and covered in their blood. But underneath the trembling, there was something else, something fierce, an undeniable iron-hard command that she had inherited from a man who ruled through the sheer gravitational force of his will. Wren had found a stack of clean mechanics rags on a nearby workbench. She had folded them into a thick, tight wad and was pressing them directly against the puncture wound just below Jess's left ribcage. The rags had been white. They were solid crimson now, warm and heavy and saturated. Wren's hands were slick to the wrists. Her forearms were streaked with dark drying lines that looked like war paint in the faint red glow of the clock. Jess gritted her teeth. A low involuntary groan escaped her lips as Wren shifted her weight and applied more pressure. The pain had morphed from the initial sharp, blinding stab into something deeper and more rhythmic, a dull, pounding throb that synced perfectly with her fading heartbeat. Each pulse sent a wave of hot agony radiating outward from the wound, followed immediately by a retreating wave of cold that left her skin prickling and numb. "I'm trying," Jess whispered. Her breath came in short, shallow pulls, each one more fragile than the last. "It's just really heavy. My eyelids, I mean." "Tell me something," Wren said, her hands slipping slightly in the crimson mess before finding their grip again. She bore down harder. Jess winced. "You fought for me and I don't even know your name. Tell me your name." "Jess. Jessamine Whitlow." "Okay, Jess, I'm Wren. You probably figured out my last name already." She tried to offer a reassuring smile, but it crumbled almost instantly, breaking apart into a quiet choke sob that she swallowed back down with visible effort. "Why did you do it?" Wren asked. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "He had a knife. You saw the knife. You could have just told him I was behind the counter and walked away." "Nobody would have blamed you." Jess turned her head slowly. The movement cost her more energy than it should have. Her cheek came to rest against the cold concrete, and she stared at the heavy steel door that separated them from the store, from the smeared trail of her own blood on the other side, from the world that was still turning even though hers was grinding to a halt. "My mom," Jess said. "Dorothea. She was a nurse, 22 years at the county hospital." Her words were starting to slur at the edges, the consonants softening, the vowels stretching. But she kept talking. Talking was the rope. Talking was the thing that kept her tethered to the surface while the dark water pulled at her legs. "She's sick now, heart failure. I work this shift to pay for her meds. $512 a month for one prescription." A wet, rattling cough interrupted her. Wren flinched at the sound, but didn't move her hands. "She taught me something when I was little. She said you don't ever turn your back when somebody needs you, even when it costs you." Jess paused. The effort of speaking was enormous. Each word had to be hauled up from a deeper place, like drawing water from a well that was running dry. "If I let them take you," Jess continued, her voice barely a thread now, "how could I look at her tomorrow? How could I look at myself?" Wren's face crumpled. She pressed her forehead against Jess's shoulder, her body shaking with silent sobs. In the harsh, unforgiving world she had grown up in, loyalty was the highest currency. It was demanded in force, sometimes beaten into you, but it was always transactional. You were loyal to the club because the club was loyal to you. You protected brothers because brothers protected you. The math was simple. The equation always balanced. But this, a stranger, a 17-year-old girl earning minimum wage at a gas station in a town that God forgot taking a knife for someone she had never met purely because her mother had taught her that it was the right thing to do. It was a foreign language to Wren Kincaid, and hearing it spoken for the first time broke her heart completely. She lifted her head. She wiped her eyes with the back of her forearm, leaving a streak of red across her cheek. She looked down at Jess, whose face was the color of candle wax, whose lips were carrying a faint blue tint that spoke of a body running out of time. "My dad is coming," Wren said. Her voice found its steel again. She forged it there, deliberately hammering it into shape through sheer force of will. Hollis Kincaid. When he gets here, he is going to make sure your mom has the best doctors in the state of Nevada. You hear me, the best. But you have to stay alive to collect. Don't you dare die on me, Jessamine Whitlow. Don't you dare. And then Wren said something quieter. Something that was not a promise or a command, but an apology delivered so softly that it almost disappeared into the hum of the broken fluorescent tube leaking light under the door. I'm sorry, Wren whispered. I'm sorry I brought this to your door. I'm sorry you're bleeding because of me. I'll never forgive myself for this. But I swear to you, Jess, if you live, I will spend the rest of my life making sure it meant something. Jess's hand, slick and cold, found Wren's wrist. Her grip was barely there, the faintest pressure of fingers that were losing their ability to close. But it was enough. Not your fault, Jess breathed. Not your fault, Wren. The clock on the wall glowed red, 2:41 a.m. Miles away, in a different kind of darkness, the atmosphere was considerably less tender. Wade Harmon kicked the rusted door of his scrapyard office shut so hard that a shower of flaking paint rained down from the frame and settled on the dirt floor like gray snow. The office was a cramped, suffocating box of corrugated metal and plywood, lit by a single bare bulb that swung from a fraying cord. It smelled of diesel, old sweat, and the chemical bite of methamphetamine residue that had seeped into the walls over the years. A disheveled man in a blood-stained apron, a local unlicensed veterinarian who moonlighted patching up men who couldn't visit hospitals, was wrapping a fiberglass splint around Boone's shattered forearm. Boone sat on an upturned crate, sweating profusely, his face the color of wet cement. The arm that the girl at the gas station had broken with the tire iron was swelling rapidly, the skin turning a mottled purple-black that spoke of shattered bone and deep tissue damage. Twitchy Greer paced near the window, gnawing on his fingernails with the frantic energy of a rat in a flooding tunnel. His ribs ached where Jess had caught him with the backswing, and every breath sent a sharp crackling pain through his left side that suggested something in there was cracked. "Wade, this is bad," Greer muttered, his eyes darting between the window and the door. "We left a mess, a big mess. If that girl bleeds out on the gas station floor, that's a murder charge. Not just county boys looking for us, the feds, kidnapping, murder, crossing county lines. That's federal." "Shut up, Greer." Wade was pacing the length of the cramped office, 6 steps one way, 6 steps back. His shaved head gleamed under the bare bulb. His jaw was working, the muscles in his cheek bunching and releasing in a steady mechanical rhythm. He was calculating, running the numbers, measuring the distance between where he stood and the edge of the cliff he was rapidly approaching. The girl at the gas station complicated things. Witnesses complicated things. But the real problem, the problem that sat in the center of Wade's chest like a block of ice, was simpler and far more terrifying. If Wren Kincaid called her father, Wade Harmon was a dead man, not figuratively, not metaphorically. Hollis Kincaid would find him, and Hollis Kincaid would kill him, and the desert would swallow whatever was left. That was not speculation. That was the law of the land, as immutable as gravity, which meant Wade had one option: get to the girl before her father did. "We can't leave her in that garage," Wade said, stopping mid-pace. His voice had dropped into a low, dangerous register, the tone of a man who has passed through panic and arrived at something colder on the other side. "If she's already called Hollis, we're on a clock. But if she hasn't, if the gas station girl talked her out of calling 911, then maybe she hasn't called anyone. Maybe they're sitting in that back room, bleeding and scared, waiting for someone to save them." He turned to face his men. His pale eyes were flat and hard. "Nobody's coming to save them." Boone groaned, clutching his newly splintered arm. "Wade, what if cops are already there?" Wade crossed to a battered police scanner sitting on a metal shelf above the desk. He turned the volume up. Static hissed and crackled. Dispatch chatter drifted through mundane and routine. A noise complaint in Henderson. A fender bender on the interstate near Fallon. Nothing about Route 11. Nothing about a stabbing at a Texaco station. Dispatch hasn't squawked a word about it, Wade said, a cold predatory certainty settling over his face. No ambulance call, no police report. That means they haven't called it in. The gas station girl is probably dead or close to it, and the Kincaid kid is hiding in that back room, too scared to make a move. He walked to the heavy gun safe in the corner, spun the combination lock. The tumblers clicked. He pulled the door open and retrieved a matte black tactical shotgun, short-barreled and brutal. He tossed a box of shells to Greer. Load it. Greer caught the box with trembling hands. His face had gone the color of old newspaper. Wade turned to the workbench and picked up a heavy dual-tank acetylene cutting torch, the kind used to slice through steel plate and industrial locks. He hefted it, feeling its weight, and something dark moved behind his eyes. They locked themselves in the mechanic's bay, Wade said. Heavy steel door, commercial deadbolt. We're going to cut straight through the lock, grab the Kincaid girl, and put a round in the gas station kid's head. No witnesses. Greer swallowed hard. The shells rattled in the box as his hands shook. And if Hollis shows up? Greer asked. His voice cracked on the name. Wade's lips pulled back from his teeth. It was not a smile. It was the expression of a cornered animal that has decided to bite. Then we make sure we have his daughter with a barrel pressed to her skull before he gets off his bike. He grabbed his keys from the desk. Let's ride. The battered Dodge Ram pulled out of the scrapyard at 3:48 a.m., its headlights cutting through the desert darkness like the eyes of something predatory and starving. Back in the Texaco garage, time had become a living thing. It stretched and distorted, pulling each minute into an agonizing, elongated hour. The digital clock on the wall read 3:55 a.m., 1 hour and 41 minutes since the knife. Jess was shivering violently now, her body entering the early stages of hypovolemic shock. Her skin had gone the color of old parchment, completely drained of warmth and vitality. Her breathing had become a series of thin, papery gasps separated by silences that lasted just long enough to make Wren's heart seize each time. Wren had draped her heavy leather vest, the oversized iron wolf's cut, with the snarling wolf patch on the back across Jess's chest. It wasn't enough. Nothing she could do was enough. The cold that was consuming Jess came from the inside, from the steady, relentless loss of blood that no amount of external warmth could replace. Wren's hands had been holding pressure for so long that her fingers had cramped into rigid claw-like shapes. The muscles in her forearms burned with a deep acidic fire. But she didn't let go. She pressed harder. "Talk to me," Wren pleaded. "Just tell me about your mom. What's her favorite thing in the world?" "She likes to bake." Jess's words were slurred, running together like watercolors in rain. "Snickerdoodles. The house always smells like cinnamon when she's feeling well enough to stand at the counter." "That sounds amazing," Wren said, her voice cracking despite her effort to hold it together. "When we get out of here, I'm going to eat a whole dozen of your mom's snickerdoodles. You and me. Deal?" A ghost of a smile flickered across Jess's gray lips. "Deal." The smile faded. Her eyes drifted closed. Jess, eyes open. "Look at me." Jess forced her lids apart. The effort was monumental. Each blink felt like lifting a concrete slab. "How long?" Jess whispered. He said 40 minutes. He has to gather everyone from 3 different places. It's been almost 90. But he's coming, Jess. I know my dad. When he says he's coming, the earth moves to get out of his way. Then the garage was flooded with light. It came without warning. Harsh, blinding white headlights swept across the frosted glass windows at the top of the garage bay doors, throwing long, sharp shadows across the concrete floor. The shadows moved, twisted, stretched into distorted, nightmarish shapes that crawled across the walls. Wren's breath seized in her throat. A heavy diesel engine rumbled outside. The sound cut off. Then came the crunch of boots on gravel. Multiple boots, heavy, deliberate. "They're back," Jess whispered. Her eyes were wide, the whites showing all around the irises. She tried to sit up, tried to reach for the pipe wrench she had spotted earlier near the hydraulic lift. But a fresh wave of agony detonated in her side and slammed her flat against the concrete. She gasped her back, arching blood pulsing fresh and hot between Wren's fingers. "Stay down," Wren hissed. She pressed harder on the wound. Her heart was hammering so violently she could feel it in her temples, in her teeth, in the roots of her hair. Heavy footsteps echoed inside the convenience store, the sound of glass shattering. Wade's crew wasn't bothering with the front door this time. They had simply smashed through the front window, the broken shards raining onto the linoleum with a bright, almost musical cascade. Boots crunched over the broken glass. Closer, closer. A heavy fist pounded against the steel door separating the store from the garage. The sound was enormous in the enclosed space, a deep booming percussion that rattled the tools hanging on the pegboard walls. "Open up, little piggies!" Wade Harmon's voice, muffled by the heavy metal, carried a casual theatrical cruelty that made Wren's skin crawl. He was enjoying this. "I know you're in there. Got the scanner on. No ambulances dispatched, no cops, no cavalry. You are completely alone." Wren squeezed her eyes shut. Her lips moved silently, forming words that were not quite prayer and not quite plea. "Dad, please, hurry." "Want to do this the hard way," Wade shouted. "Fine by me, Greer. Fire it up." A sharp, aggressive hiss erupted on the other side of the door, followed immediately by the crackling roar of an acetylene torch igniting. The sound was unmistakable, a focused, sustained blast of concentrated flame that could cut through steel plate like a hot wire through butter. Wren watched in horror as the small circle of metal near the deadbolt began to change color. It started as a dull, bruised purple, the molecular structure of the steel beginning to break down under the assault of 3,000-degree heat. Then it brightened to cherry red, then to a fierce, angry orange that cast dancing shadows across the concrete floor. The heat radiating from the door was immediate. Wren could feel it on her face from 6 feet away, a dry, scorching wave that smelled of burning metal and ozone. "Jess," Wren whispered. "Jess, they're cutting through the lock." Jess had managed to roll onto her stomach. The movement left a fresh, glistening trail of red on the concrete. She was dragging herself inch by agonizing inch across the floor toward the heavy pipe wrench resting near the base of the hydraulic lift. Her left hand clutched the wound. Her right hand reached, fingers extended, trembling, grasping at the cold metal handle. She wrapped her bloody fingers around it. The wrench was enormously heavy, 20 pounds of forged steel, but she pulled it to her chest and held on. "Hide!" Jess gasped, her voice barely audible over the roar of the torch. "Get in the pit." She gestured weakly toward the oil-changing pit set into the floor beneath the hydraulic lift. It was narrow and dark, maybe 4 feet deep, filled with a few inches of filthy runoff water and oil residue. A terrible hiding place. But a hiding place nonetheless. "I'm not leaving you," Wren cried, gripping Jess's shoulder. "They want you." Jess's eyes found Wren's. In the hellish orange glow of the overheating door, Jess's face was skeletal, drained of every shade of color except the stark, startling blue of her eyes. Those eyes burned with something that transcended the pain and the fear and the creeping tide of blood loss. Conviction. Pure. Blinding. Final. "If they get you, my dying means nothing. Everything I did means nothing. Get in the pit, now." The lock sparked violently. A shower of white-hot molten metal sprayed from the door, hissing and popping, where the droplets hit the linoleum on the other side. The circle of glowing metal was nearly complete. "Almost through," Wade's muffled voice called from the other side. The sound was giddy, almost childlike in its cruelty. "Ready or not?" Wren looked at Jess, at the girl who had taken a knife for her, at the bloody pipe wrench clutched in trembling hands that should have been holding a textbook, at the fading light in eyes that should have been bright with 17 years of unlived life. She understood. If she was captured, this girl's sacrifice would become meaningless, a wasted death on a gas station floor, another forgotten body in a forgotten town, crying silently. Wren lowered herself into the cramped, foul-smelling pit. The cold, oily water soaked through her jeans immediately. She pulled a piece of heavy cardboard over the opening, pressing herself flat against the bottom of the pit. Her hand clamped over her own mouth to muffle her breathing. Darkness, total and suffocating. Above her, a loud metallic clang shook the garage. The deadbolt gave way. The heavy steel door swung inward, crashing against the concrete block wall, with a force that knocked a fire extinguisher from its mount. It clattered to the floor and rolled. Wade Harmon stepped into the garage. He was silhouetted against the harsh fluorescent light spilling in from the ruined convenience store. The smoking acetylene torch hung from his left hand, its flame reduced to a thin, hissing blue tongue. In his right hand, the serrated hunting knife. Behind him, Twitchy Greer followed the tactical shotgun pressed against his shoulder, the barrel sweeping the room with jerky, nervous movements. Wade's boots crunched on the gritty concrete. His pale eyes swept the garage, adjusting to the dimness. He spotted the blood trail immediately, a wide, glistening path that led from the door to the base of the hydraulic lift. He followed it with his gaze, and there was Jess. She lay on her stomach, painfully propping herself up on one elbow, the heavy pipe wrench clutched in her right hand. Her uniform shirt was soaked through, black with blood in the low light. Her face was the color of ash, but her eyes were open, and they were aimed directly at Wade Harmon. Wade extinguished the torch and set it on the floor. He straightened up, rolling his neck, and looked down at the girl with an expression that mingled genuine surprise with something that in a different man might have been admiration. "Kidda," Wade said, his voice low and almost conversational. "You have got more guts than any man I've ever met. And I mean that, but guts don't stop shotgun shells." Jess didn't speak. She didn't have the breath for it. She just stared at him. Her jaw clenched so tight the tendons in her neck stood out like cables, waiting for whatever came next. Wade took a step closer. He raised the knife. "Where's the Kincaid girl? Tell me and I make this quick. You've earned that much." Jess's cracked, bloodless lips moved. Wade leaned in slightly to hear. "Go to hell." Blood flecked her lips as she said it. Wade sighed, a sound of tired resignation. He shifted his grip on the knife and took another step forward. "Have it your way." He raised the blade. And then the world began to vibrate. It did not start as a sound. It started as a feeling. A deep subsonic tremor that originated somewhere far beneath the concrete floor and traveled upward through the foundation, through the cracked slab, through the soles of Wade Harmon's boots, and into the marrow of his bones. Wade froze. The knife hung suspended in the air, forgotten. He looked down. The loose grit and dust on the concrete floor had begun to move. Not settling, not shifting, dancing. The tiny particles vibrated and jumped, forming intricate shimmering patterns that looked like the surface of a pond, disturbed by something massive moving beneath it. Greer lowered the shotgun slightly. His twitchy eyes darted around the garage, scanning the walls, the ceiling, the floor. "Wade!" Greer's voice pitched high and tight. "What the hell is that earthquake?" It was not an earthquake. The vibration intensified. The heavy wrenches hanging on the pegboard walls began to rattle against their hooks. A coffee can full of bolts on the workbench walked itself to the edge and tipped over, spilling its contents across the concrete with a bright cascading clatter. Then the sound arrived. It came over the horizon like a wave, not the sharp, piercing wail of sirens, not the low rumble of a passing truck on the interstate. This was something else entirely, something older, something primal. A deep guttural synchronized roar that rolled across the flat desert floor with the unstoppable momentum of a freight train. It was the sound of heavy American iron, straight pipes, and high-octane fuel. V-twin engines pushed to their red lines, 200 of them converging from 3 directions and merging into a single massive formation on Route 11. The sound grew until it wasn't just sound anymore. It was pressure, physical atmospheric pressure that compressed the air inside the garage and made the eardrums flex and the chest cavity tighten. The frosted glass windows at the top of the garage bay doors began to rattle violently in their frames. Wade Harmon's face changed. The predatory confidence drained out of it like water from a cracked vessel replaced by something raw and ancient. Recognition. The recognition of a prey animal that has just heard the pack. He turned slowly toward the windows. The darkness outside was pierced by light. Not 2 headlights, not 4, not a dozen. A wall of light. A blinding horizontal avalanche of halogen and LED that stretched across the entire visible width of Route 11 and beyond, spilling off the road and into the scrubland on either side. The advancing curtain of white fire turned the desert night into something approximating high noon. The roar became deafening. It penetrated the cinder block walls. It shook dust from the ceiling joists. It vibrated the steel door on its hinges and made the hanging fan belt sway like a pendulum. Greer dropped the shotgun. The weapon hit the oil-stained concrete and skidded away from him, completely forgotten. He pressed his palms flat against his ears, backing away until his spine hid the workbench. "Wade!" Greer screamed the word, visible on his lips but inaudible in the thunder. "They're here! The wolves are here!" Wade Harmon stood in the center of the garage, the hunting knife trembling in his hand. And for the first time in 20 years of violence and intimidation and desert brutality, he looked exactly like what he was. A small man in a very large storm. The garage bay door buckled inward. The rusted aluminum panels bowed under an impact from outside, the metal groaning and screeching as something massive pressed against it. Through the frosted glass, Wade could see silhouettes. Enormous silhouettes dismounting from enormous machines. Jess lay on the floor, her vision collapsing into a narrow, darkening tunnel. The pipe wrench had slipped from her fingers. She didn't have the strength to hold it anymore. But through the tunnel, through the fading gray, she could see the aluminum door bowing inward. She could feel the vibrations through the concrete beneath her cheek. They came, she thought. The words floated through her mind with a strange detached clarity, like a leaf drifting on the surface of a still pond. Her dad actually came. Outside, a massive diesel-powered tow truck, painted the same matte black as the Iron Wolves motorcycles, reversed toward the garage. A man with a braided gray beard and arms like bridge cables leaped from the flatbed. He moved with practiced brutal efficiency, hauling a thick logging chain over his shoulder and hooking the forged steel links directly to the bottom handle of the bay door. Inside, Wade snapped out of his paralysis. Survival instinct overrode everything else. He lunged toward the oil-changing pit, dropping to his knees, clawing at the heavy cardboard that covered the opening. If he could get the girl, if he could get Wren Kincaid with a blade at her throat, he still had leverage. He still had a card to play. He never reached her. The diesel truck outside slammed into gear. The heavy chain snapped taut with a metallic shriek that split the air like a scream. In a single violent catastrophic motion, the entire aluminum garage bay door was ripped from its tracks. The metal tore apart with a deafening crunch, rivets popping like gunshots, the frame twisting and buckling as the door was dragged out into the parking lot and discarded on the asphalt like a piece of crumpled foil. A wall of dust, exhaust fumes, and pulverized concrete billowed into the mechanic's bay. The blinding glare of 100 headlights flooded the space, turning the darkness into a searing white-hot stage. Through the swirling dust, figures emerged. They did not rush in like police officers. They did not shout commands or announce themselves. They walked, slowly, deliberately, with the unhurried gravitational swagger of men who own the ground beneath their boots. A creeping tide of scarred leather, faded denim, and heavy steel-toed boots advanced through the ruined doorway. At the center of the formation stood a man who seemed to swallow all the light in the room. Hollis Kincaid, iron. He was a giant, 6'4", with shoulders as wide as a barn door and a chest like the front end of a locomotive. His face was a topographic map of old violence crisscrossed with faded white scars that told stories no one had the nerve to ask about. His dark eyes burned with a cold, patient fury that was infinitely more terrifying than rage. Rage burns hot and fast and careless. This was something else. This was the calculated, methodical intensity of a man who had already decided exactly what was going to happen and was simply moving through the steps. He wore a heavily weathered black leather cut over a dark flannel shirt. The snarling wolf patch of the Iron Wolves was prominent on his chest, flanked by the President rocker. The leather was old, cracked in places, stained with things that didn't wash out. It was not a costume. It was a second skin. Hollis stepped over the ruined threshold of the garage. His heavy boots crunched on the twisted aluminum debris. 200 idling motorcycles outside provided a continuous menacing soundtrack that made the very air inside the building vibrate. Two massive men flanked him. Brick, a man built like an industrial refrigerator, with tattooed knuckles and a shaved head that gleamed in the headlight glare. And Coyote, lean and silent, with a long gray ponytail and eyes that missed nothing, his hands resting with practiced ease on the heavy leather holster at his hip. Wade Harmon was still on his knees beside the pit. His hands hovered over the cardboard. The blood had drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a wax figure of himself, pale and hollow and diminished. He raised his hands. "Hollis!" Wade's voice cracked on the second syllable. "Hollis, listen. This is a misunderstanding. We were just—" Hollis Kincaid did not speak. He did not blink. He simply moved his head, a fraction of an inch to the left. The smallest, most economical gesture imaginable. A twitch that carried the weight of a death warrant. Brick and Coyote moved. They crossed the garage with terrifying speed, their heavy boots eating up the distance in 3 strides. Coyote reached Greer first. He grabbed the twitchy man by the throat with one lean iron hand and hoisted him off his feet, slamming him against the cinder block wall with a bone-jarring impact that cracked the mortar between the blocks. Greer's feet kicked uselessly in the air, his hands clawing at Coyote's wrist. Coyote held him there the way a man holds a dish rag with effortless, indifferent strength. Brick reached Wade. He didn't grab him. He simply wrapped both massive hands around the front of Wade's jacket, lifted him entirely off the floor, as though he weighed nothing, and hurled him backward. Wade sailed through the air and crashed into a stack of radial tires. The rubber absorbed some of the impact, but not the humiliation. He lay gasping in the wreckage, the hunting knife knocked from his hand, skittering across the concrete and coming to rest near the wall. Hollis ignored both of them. His dark burning eyes swept the room, searching, scanning through the dust and the blood and the harsh crossfire of headlight beams. "Wren!" His voice was not a shout. It was a deep, resonant rumble that cut through the sound of 200 idling engines the way a church bell cuts through fog. It carried authority so absolute that it seemed to bend the air itself. The heavy cardboard over the pit shifted. Wren pushed it aside. She rose slowly from the dark, oily water. Her clothes soaked her face, smeared with grease and tears and Jess Whitlow's blood. She looked up at the towering silhouette of her father, backlit by the blinding wall of headlights, and her lower lip began to tremble with a force she could no longer control. "Dad!" The word came out broken, shattered into syllables by the sheer magnitude of the relief and the terror and the grief that had been building inside her chest for the past 2 hours. Hollis Kincaid's stoic facade cracked. It did not shatter. It did not collapse. It cracked the way granite cracks under sustained invisible pressure. A single fissure that ran through the terrifying exterior and exposed for just a moment what was underneath. Not a president, not a commander, not the most feared man in 3 states. A father. A desperate, terrified father who had ridden 40 miles through the desert night at 100 miles per hour, rallying 200 men from 3 separate locations because his 16-year-old daughter was bleeding and afraid. He crossed the garage in 2 enormous strides. He dropped to his knees on the oil-stained concrete, the impact sending a jolt through the floor. He pulled Wren into his arms and held her against his chest with a ferocity that was indistinguishable from gentleness. His massive shoulders shook, just once, just slightly, a tremor that no one in the room except his daughter would ever be permitted to see. "I got you, baby," Hollis whispered. His voice was thick, rough, stripped of every layer of command and authority, until nothing remained but the raw, unguarded love of a parent, holding a child he had been terrified he would never hold again. "I got you. Nobody is ever going to touch you again." Wren buried her face in his leather vest. She clung to him, her fingers digging into the worn hide, her body racked with sobs that came from a place so deep they were almost silent. But even in her relief, even in the desperate sanctuary of her father's arms, she did not forget. She pulled back. Her blood-stained hands gripped his thick forearms. She turned her head toward the corner of the garage, toward the base of the hydraulic lift where the shadows were deepest. "Dad," Wren said, her voice raw and cracked, but absolutely clear. "You have to help her." She stepped in front of the knife. "She fought all three of them. Dad, she's dying because of me. You have to save her." Hollis Kincaid stood slowly. The crack in his facade sealed itself. The terrified father disappeared, replaced instantly by the battlefield commander. His gaze followed his daughter's trembling, pointing finger into the shadows beneath the lift. There, lying in a vast, spreading pool of dark blood that reflected the headlights like a black mirror, was Jessamine Whitlow. She was barely conscious. Her eyes were slits, the blue irises barely visible beneath heavy, fluttering lids. Her breathing was a series of thin, wet, raspy sounds, separated by gaps that grew longer with each cycle. The pipe wrench lay beside her hand, released at last. The blood-soaked mechanic's rags had fallen away from the wound, and the puncture below her ribs was visible, ragged and dark, and still weeping. Hollis knelt beside her. The concrete trembled under his weight. He looked at the wound, at the blood, at the trail across the floor where a 17-year-old girl had dragged her dying body across rough concrete with a 20-pound wrench in her fist, just to buy a stranger a few more seconds of life. Something moved in his dark eyes, something that went beyond respect, beyond gratitude. In the violent tribal world of the Iron Wolves, courage was the highest currency, the only coin that could not be counterfeited. And this girl, this minimum-wage textbook-reading, scrap-hauling girl, who should have been home in bed, had just spent every last cent she had. "Kid," Hollis said. His deep voice was surprisingly gentle. "Kid, can you hear me?" Jess's eyes focused. Barely. The face swimming into her collapsing field of vision was enormous and terrifying, framed by a dark beard and scarred skin and eyes that looked like they had negotiated personally with the devil. "I kept the door locked," Jess whispered. The words were almost inaudible, distant, as though she was speaking from the bottom of a well. "As long as I could." Hollis looked at the heavy steel door with its melted lock, at the pipe wrench, at the smeared handprints of blood on the concrete where she had crawled. He nodded once, a slow, heavy movement that carried more weight than any words he could have spoken. "Doc!" Hollis roared over his shoulder, the gentleness gone, replaced by a command that could have shattered glass. "Get in here now!" A wiry man pushed through the crowd of bikers at the ruined doorway. Doc Sawyer. He was in his late 40s, heavily tattooed with close-cropped salt and pepper hair, and the sharp, quick eyes of a man trained to assess trauma in seconds. He had served 2 combat tours as a field medic in Fallujah, Iraq, before trading desert camouflage for black leather. He carried a massive olive-drab canvas bag, the kind designed for field surgery, strapped to the back of the diesel tow truck. He had grabbed it on the way in. He dropped to his knees beside Jess on the opposite side from Hollis and tore the canvas bag open in a single practiced motion. "She's crashing, boss," Doc muttered. His hands were already moving, cutting away the blood-soaked uniform shirt with heavy trauma shears exposing the pale skin and the ragged, gaping puncture wound. He pressed 2 fingers against her carotid artery. His expression tightened. "Pulse is thready. 80 over nothing. Blade missed the lung, but it nicked something arterial. She's been bleeding out internally for almost 2 hours. Fix her, Hollis said. The two words left zero room for negotiation, interpretation, or failure. I need pressure, hard pressure. Doc barked, ripping open a thick roll of hemostatic gauze, the military-grade kind, designed to clot traumatic battlefield wounds on contact. Hold her down. This is going to hurt. To Jess's fading consciousness, the garage became a whirlwind of motion and sound. She felt the agonizing, blinding shock of Doc Sawyer packing the medicated gauze directly into the stab wound, a searing chemical burn that snapped her eyes wide open in a silent scream. Her body convulsed involuntarily, every muscle contracting against the pain. Heavy leather-clad hands pinned her shoulders and legs to the concrete, holding her immobile with firm but careful pressure. Look at me, kid. Hollis Kincaid leaned in close, so close that his face filled Jess's entire remaining field of vision. The scars, the dark eyes, the absolute unwavering certainty that radiated from him like heat from a furnace. Look at me. My name is Hollis. You protected my blood tonight, my daughter. That means you are my blood now, and iron wolves do not die on a garage floor. You hear me, you stay in this fight. Jess locked eyes with the terrifying biker king, and somehow, impossibly, the sheer, overwhelming force of his will seemed to reach into the darkness that was pulling her under and anchor her to the waking world. She gritted her teeth. She nodded, a faint, almost imperceptible movement. But Hollis saw it. IVs in Mishasha, Doc announced, securing a heavy needle into the crook of Jess's arm and squeezing a bag of saline and plasma expander. I've got the bleed temporarily packed, but she needs a surgeon. She needed a surgeon 90 minutes ago. If we wait for a helicopter, she's gone. Hollis stood. The terrifying stillness had returned to his posture. He looked at Wren, who was being shielded by 3 massive bikers near the doorway. Then he looked across the room at Wade Harmon, who was still crumpled in the pile of tires, Brick standing over him, with the patient, unhurried menace of a man who had all the time in the world. Hollis made 3 decisions in approximately 4 seconds. Brick, he said, his voice dropping to that quiet register that was somehow more frightening than any shout. Throw that piece of trash in the trunk. Take his twitchy friend, too. Wade shrieked. The sound was high and desperate and utterly stripped of dignity. Hollis, please. I'll give you the scrapyard. I'll give you the roots. I'll give you everything. Please. You put a blade in a girl who was protecting my daughter, Hollis stated. His voice was flat, clinical, the voice of a man reading a verdict that had already been decided. Your roots belong to me anyway, and your life ended the second you crossed the county line. Brick's massive fist connected with Wade's jaw. The impact was short and precise and absolute. Wade's eyes rolled back. His body went limp. Brick threw the unconscious man over his shoulder like a sack of grain and carried him out through the ruined garage door into the blinding sea of headlights. Coyote released Greer's throat. The twitchy man crumpled to the floor, gasping, only to be hauled up by the collar and dragged out into the night, his boots leaving parallel grooves in the dust. What would happen to them in the deep, unforgiving Nevada desert was a dark certainty that no one in the room questioned or discussed. Hollis turned to face the crowd of men gathered at the destroyed doorway. 200 faces, hard and scarred and weathered by lives lived outside the boundaries of polite society, stared back at him, waiting, ready. Mount up! Hollis roared. His voice carried over the idling engines like a cannon shot. We are taking the interstate. I want a rolling blockade, full formation, nothing gets past us. We are taking this girl to Ridgestone General, and we are going to own the highway from here to the emergency room doors. Doc Sawyer and another biker carefully lifted Jess onto a makeshift stretcher, fashioned from a heavy canvas tarp. Her head lolled to the side. An oxygen mask pulled from Doc's bag was strapped over her mouth and nose. The portable vitals monitor clipped to her finger beeped with a weak, unsteady rhythm. Dad, Ren said, running to Hollis's side as they carried Jess toward the tow truck. Is she going to make it? Hollis put his heavy calloused hand on his daughter's shoulder. He looked down at the stretcher, at the girl who was barely clinging to the wrong side of her life. She's a fighter, Ren, Hollis said softly. And she's riding with us now. We don't leave our people behind. They loaded Jess into the back of the black diesel tow truck. Doc climbed in beside her, immediately reconnecting the IV line and resuming pressure on the wound. Ren climbed in after him, refusing to leave Jess's side her hand, finding Jess's cold limp fingers and squeezing them. Hollis Kincaid walked to his custom midnight black chopper. He swung his leg over the saddle, the heavy suspension groaning under his weight. He settled into the seat, wrapped his scarred hands around the handlebars, and looked back at the tow truck. Then he raised his right fist into the air. 200 riders kicked their machines into gear. The sound shook the last remaining glass from the station's shattered windows and cracked the pavement of the Texaco parking lot. Hollis dropped his fist. The Iron Wolves surged forward onto Route 11. They did not obey the speed limit. They did not stop for the single traffic light in Ridgestone. They formed a massive, impenetrable V formation across all 4 lanes of the interstate, a rolling wall of steel chrome and black leather that consumed the road entirely. The diesel tow truck rode in the center of the formation, shielded on all sides by the roaring iron cavalry. 10 miles ahead, Trooper Aldrin Beckett was parked behind a rusted billboard on the interstate shoulder, fighting off exhaustion with a lukewarm thermos of black coffee. His radar gun sat dormant on the dashboard. It was 4:22 a.m. Route 11 was dead at this hour. His radar gun shrieked to life. The digital display flashed 85, then 95, then maxed out, and blinked in frantic red protest. Beckett dropped his thermos. Coffee splashed across his pressed trousers. He grabbed the radio. Dispatch Unit 7. Massive speed violation heading northbound. Sounds like a full convoy. He pulled onto the highway, lights flashing. He didn't even have time to accelerate. 200 motorcycles crested the rise, headlights, blazing engines, screaming, filling all 4 lanes in a solid, unstoppable wall of sound and light. They did not slow. They did not swerve. They came on with the absolute, undeniable momentum of a natural disaster. Beckett threw his cruiser into reverse and backed violently onto the dirt shoulder. The wind displacement from the passing formation rocked his vehicle on its suspension. He locked eyes with Hollis Kincaid for a fraction of a second as the massive biker roared past. The face beneath the helmet was not defiant. It was not aggressive. It was desperate, urgent. The face of a man racing against something that had nothing to do with the law. Beckett looked past the motorcycles. He saw the matte black tow truck in the center of the formation. He saw the Iron Wolves colors. He saw Doc Sawyer's hands visible through the truck's rear window, working frantically over a prone figure. Trooper Aldrin Beckett had been in law enforcement for 23 years. He had pulled over drunks and drug runners and men with warrants thick enough to wallpaper a room. He had enforced the letter of the law in all weathers and all conditions, because that was what he had sworn to do. But some moments transcend the letter. Some debts of honor do not fit neatly into the penal code. Beckett flipped his sirens to full volume, executed a sharp U-turn, and floored the accelerator. He pulled ahead of the formation and began blocking intersections. His cherry-red light bar cutting through the pre-dawn darkness, clearing the path for the outlaw convoy behind him. In the back of the truck, Jess's heart rate was dropping. Doc Sawyer worked with the grim, focused intensity of a man who had kept soldiers alive in far worse conditions than this. Ren held Jess's hand. She squeezed. She talked. She whispered the same words over and over, a mantra, a prayer, a lifeline thrown into the dark water. Hold on. Just hold on. We're almost there. Jess's eyes fluttered. The vibration of the heavy tires on the asphalt hummed through her body. The last thing she saw before her eyes finally closed, and the gray swallowed. Everything was the view through the truck's rear window. An endless sea of red taillights stretching out behind her into the desert night. 200 Iron Angels riding in formation, clearing a path through the darkness to save her life. The convoy hit the outskirts of Ridgestone at 4:39 a.m. The emergency room of Ridgestone General Hospital was 17 minutes away. Jess Whitlow had approximately 12 minutes of blood left in her body. The math was not in her favor. But 200 engines roared their disagreement into the fading night, and the desert for once had the good sense to get out of the way. The fluorescent lights inside the emergency room of Ridgestone General Hospital had not flickered once in 3 years. The building was old, but maintained with stubborn institutional pride by a skeleton crew of nurses and technicians who understood that in a town like Ridgestone, this small underfunded hospital was the only barrier between the living and the dead for 60 miles in any direction. At 4:31 a.m. on that August morning, the emergency room was quiet. 2 patients occupied the waiting area. An elderly man with a suspected kidney stone sat hunched in a plastic chair, his wife rubbing slow circles on his back. A teenage boy with a badly sprained ankle from a skateboarding accident dozed against his mother's shoulder, an ice pack melting slowly on his elevated foot. Dr. Harrison Mercer stood at the nurse's station, reviewing charts on a battered computer monitor. He was 57 years old, lean and sharp-featured, with close-cropped gray hair and the deeply lined face of a man who had spent 3 decades opening bodies, repairing what was broken inside and sewing them shut again. He had trained at Johns Hopkins. He had done his residency at a Level 1 trauma center in Baltimore, where gunshot wounds and stabbings arrived with the regularity of buses. He had come to Ridgestone 15 years ago for reasons he rarely discussed, something about a divorce and a desire to practice medicine in a place where he could hear himself think. He had not handled a serious stabbing case in over 2 years. Head nurse Brenda Carmichael, a stout woman with steel gray hair pinned in a tight bun and reading glasses perpetually perched on the end of her nose, was sorting medication trays beside him. She hummed tunelessly as she worked, a habit that Dr. Mercer had long ago stopped noticing. The humming stopped. Brenda looked up. Her hands paused over the tray. She tilted her head slightly, the way a dog tilts its head at a sound too faint for human ears. "Do you feel that?" she asked. Dr. Mercer frowned. He set down his coffee cup. Now that she mentioned it, he did feel something. A faint vibration, almost subliminal, traveling through the linoleum floor and up through the soles of his shoes. The pens in the cup holder on the counter began to rattle softly. The surface of his coffee trembled, concentric rings spreading outward from the center of the mug. "Earthquake," Brenda said, her eyes widening. She gripped the edge of the counter. Dr. Mercer didn't answer. He was staring through the massive plate glass windows that formed the front wall of the emergency room. The parking lot beyond was dark and empty, illuminated by a handful of sodium vapor lights that cast everything in a sickly amber glow. Then the lights came. They appeared over the low rise at the southern end of the hospital access road, a horizontal wall of blazing white that stretched across the entire width of the 2-lane road and spilled over onto the shoulders on either side. The wall advanced rapidly, accompanied by a sound that built from a low rumble to a chest-compressing roar in the span of seconds. Motorcycles poured into the hospital parking lot. They jumped curbs. They mounted the manicured grass strips between the parking lanes. They fanned out across the lot with the coordinated precision of a military operation, filling every available space and creating an impenetrable perimeter around the ambulance bay. The plate glass windows vibrated so violently that Dr. Mercer instinctively stepped back, certain they were about to shatter. The elderly man with the kidney stone sat bolt upright. His wife clutched his arm. The teenage boy jerked awake, his ice pack sliding off his ankle and hitting the floor with a wet splat. Brenda reached for the emergency lockdown button. She never pressed it. The automatic sliding glass doors of the emergency room entrance were forced open from outside. They parted with a mechanical groan, and through them strode a man who made the doorframe look small. Hollis Kincaid was covered in desert dust. His black leather cut was streaked with dark stains that Dr. Mercer's trained eye immediately identified as blood, not his own. His boots left prints on the freshly mopped floor. Behind him, 10 of his largest men formed a wall of leather and muscle that filled the entire entrance corridor. They did not shout. They did not threaten. They simply occupied the space with a physical authority that made the air feel heavier. "I need a trauma team," Hollis said. His voice was not a request. It rolled through the emergency room like a boulder dropping into a still lake, displacing everything in its path. Right now. Dr. Mercer stepped forward. His heart was hammering against his sternum with a violence that surprised him, but his hands were steady. 30 years of trauma surgery had wired his nervous system to separate fear from function. Fear was allowed to exist. It simply was not allowed to drive. "Sir, you can't bring an entire club into my emergency room. I need you to shut up and listen to me." Hollis closed the distance in 3 strides. He was suddenly standing directly in front of Doctor Mercer, towering over him by a full 7 inches, and the doctor could see every scar on the man's face in exquisite, terrifying detail. Could smell the desert dust and engine oil and blood that clung to him like a second skin. "I have a 17-year-old girl bleeding out from a deep knife wound to the abdomen. She's been down for over 2 hours, arterial involvement. My medic packed the bleed with hemostatic gauze and started a saline line, but she needs surgical intervention immediately. Her heart rate is in the 40s and dropping." Hollis paused, his dark eyes locked onto Dr. Mercer's with an intensity that made the doctor's vision narrow to a single point. "If she dies in this hospital, I am going to hold you personally responsible. Do we understand each other?" Before Dr. Mercer could respond, the sliding doors opened again. Doc Sawyer and another biker burst through, carrying a blood-soaked canvas tarp between them. On it lay Jessamine Whitlow. Doctor Mercer saw the girl and everything else disappeared. The bikers, the noise, the intimidation, all of it fell away like a dropped curtain. He saw the ashen skin and the blue-tinged lips. He saw the massive volume of blood saturating the improvised stretcher. He saw the oxygen mask fogging with weak, shallow breaths. He saw a 17-year-old body that was running out of time with the terrifying speed of a car approaching a cliff edge. "Trauma 1, move!" Dr. Mercer shouted, his voice snapping into the sharp, commanding register that 3 decades of emergency medicine had forged. "Brenda Page, anesthesiology. Get me 2 units of O-negative on a rapid infuser. I want a surgical tray prepped and a central line kit at bedside. Portable ultrasound to trauma 1. Let's go, let's go, let's go." The emergency room detonated into controlled chaos. Nurses appeared from doorways and corridors, moving with the urgent practice choreography of people trained to function in crisis. A gurney materialized. Jess was transferred from the canvas tarp, Doc Sawyer running alongside, rattling off vitals, blood pressure. Estimates the type of gauze he had used, the approximate time elapsed since the wound was inflicted. The double doors of the trauma bay swung shut behind them. The waiting room fell into a heavy, dense silence. Hollis Kincaid stood in the center of the room. His massive chest rose and fell with deep, controlled breaths. His hands hung at his sides, the knuckles white. He stared at the closed trauma doors with an expression that was impossible to read and terrifying to look at. Wren came through the entrance moments later, escorted by 2 more bikers. Her clothes were soaked with Jess's blood. Her face was a mask of dried tears and engine grease. She crossed the waiting room at a run and threw her arms around her father's waist, pressing her face into his chest. Hollis wrapped one arm around her. He held her, but his eyes never left the trauma doors. "Declan." Hollis spoke without turning. The name carried across the room to a tall, lean man with a silver streak cutting through dark hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same desert rock as the landscape outside. Declan Holt, Vice President. A man whose reputation for cold, ruthless efficiency was second only to Hollis's own. "Yeah, boss." Declan stepped forward. "The girl's name is Jessamine Whitlow. She said her mother is sick. Dorothea Whitlow. She lives somewhere in Ridgestone." Hollis's voice was raw, stripped of command and authority. Just a man tired and afraid asking for something to be done. Take 4 guys, find her, bring her here safely. She should be with her daughter. Declan nodded once. He turned on his heel, pointed at 4 men near the entrance, and walked out without another word. The 4 followed. 5 motorcycle engines roared to life in the parking lot, then faded into the pre-dawn darkness. Hollis guided Wren to a plastic chair along the wall. He lowered himself into the seat beside her, the chair groaning under his weight. He put his arm around his daughter's shoulders. She leaned into him, her eyes closed, her breathing finally beginning to slow from the ragged, desperate pace it had held for 3 hours. The siege of Richton General had begun. For the next 4 hours, the hospital operated under a set of rules that appeared in no administrative handbook. Local police cruisers drove past the parking lot, their officers observing the 200 motorcycles and the heavily built men stationed at every entrance. The cruisers kept driving. The Iron Wolves did not interfere with hospital staff or other patients. Ambulances were allowed to pass through the perimeter without obstruction. But nobody entered or left the emergency room waiting area without Hollis Kincaid's awareness and implicit permission. It was not a takeover. It was a vigil. A massive mechanical leather-clad vigil mounted by men who understood that one of their own was fighting for her life behind those doors. And the fact that Jess Whitlow had never ridden a motorcycle or worn a patch was to every man in that parking lot entirely irrelevant. She had bled for the president's daughter. She was theirs now. Inside Trauma 1, Dr. Harrison Mercer fought a war. The initial ultrasound confirmed what Doc Sawyer had suspected. The serrated blade of Wade Harmon's hunting knife had missed Jess's left lung by less than 2 millimeters a margin so thin that Dr. Mercer would later describe it to a colleague as the distance between living and dying being measured in the width of a fingernail. But the knife had not missed everything. It had sliced deeply into a branch of the inferior vena cava, the massive vein that carries deoxygenated blood from the lower body back to the heart. The hemostatic gauze that Doc Sawyer had packed into the wound had partially clotted the tear, buying precious time. But the clot was fragile, and the damage to the vessel wall was extensive. Dr. Mercer needed to open her up, locate the tear, and repair it before the clot failed entirely, and Jess bled out on his table. He scrubbed in. The anesthesiologist, a quiet, precise woman named Dr. Ellen Hargrove, induced general anesthesia and intubated. The surgical team draped the field. Dr. Mercer made his incision. What he found inside was a battlefield. The abdominal cavity was flooded with blood, both fresh and partially clotted. Loops of small intestine glistened under the surgical light, slippery and displaced by the accumulation of fluid. Dr. Mercer suctioned and irrigated, clearing the field with practiced methodical precision, following the damage like a tracker follows a trail. The knife had entered at a downward angle, consistent with a taller attacker striking a shorter victim. It had sliced through the abdominal wall, nicked the transverse colon, and buried itself in the tributary of the inferior vena cava, before being ripped back out. The extraction had done almost as much damage as the insertion. The serrated edge of the blade had torn the vessel wall on the way out, creating a ragged, irregular laceration that was far more difficult to repair than a clean cut. Dr. Mercer worked with the focused intensity of a man defusing a bomb. His hands moved with microscopic precision, clamping, suturing, grafting, reinforcing. The operating room was silent except for the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, the whisper of the ventilator, and Dr. Mercer's occasional clipped instructions to his team. At 5:17 a.m., Jess's heart stopped. The monitor flatlined. The long, continuous tone cut through the operating room like a razor. Doctor. Mercer felt the sound in his spine. VFib. Charge to 200. The defibrillator paddles were placed. The charge was delivered. Jess's body arched off the table. The monitor remained flat. Charge to 300. A second shock. A second arch. Silence. Then a blip. Faint. Irregular. But there. The green line on the monitor twitched, stuttered, and then found a rhythm, weak and thready but present. "She's back," Dr. Hargrove said quietly. Dr. Mercer did not pause. He continued the repair, his hands utterly steady, despite the sweat beading on his forehead beneath the surgical cap. The graft held, the sutures held. He closed the colon laceration, irrigated the cavity again, checked for additional bleeders, found none. At 6:43 a.m., Jess's heart stopped again. The second arrest lasted 41 seconds during which Dr. Harrison Mercer, a man who had lost patients before and understood the clinical reality of death, pumped the chest of a 17-year-old girl with his own hands because the mechanical compressor was on the other side of the room, and 41 seconds was 41 seconds. The heart restarted. Dr. Mercer closed the surgical wound. He placed drain tubes. He dressed the incision. He stepped back from the table and pulled his mask down his face, gray with exhaustion. "She's going to ICU," he said. "Medically induced coma. I want round-the-clock monitoring. If that graft blows, I need to be paged immediately. Somebody get me her blood type and cross-match for 4 more units." He stripped his gloves and walked toward the scrub room. His hands, now that the work was done, had begun to tremble. He held them under the hot water and let them shake. Outside, the Nevada sun was climbing above the eastern ridgeline, pouring harsh golden light across the parking lot of Ridgestone General. The motorcycles sat in silent rows, their chrome catching the first rays and throwing blinding diamonds of reflected light across the hospital facade. Bikers sat on curbs, leaned against their machines, and passed coffee cups between them. The engines were off now. But the presence remained solid and immovable, a wall of leather and iron and loyalty that showed no sign of leaving. In the waiting room, the air was thick with the smell of sweat leather and the burnt coffee residue of a vending machine that had been emptied twice. Hollis sat in the same plastic chair he had occupied for 4 hours. His leather cut was draped over the back of the chair beside him. His massive forearms rested on his knees. Wren was asleep against his shoulder, her face finally peaceful, her hand still faintly stained with rust-colored traces that no amount of bathroom soap had fully removed. The double doors of the surgical wing clicked open. Dr. Mercer walked through. He looked like a man who had aged 5 years in 4 hours. His blue scrubs were stained. His surgical cap was crumpled in his hand. Dark circles ringed his eyes. Every single biker in the waiting room stood up simultaneously. The collective sound of leather shifting and heavy bodies rising filled the room with a sudden charged pressure that made the overhead lights seem to dim. Hollis gently shifted Wren, easing her head onto the chair, and rose to his full height. He approached the doctor. His face was unreadable. "Well?" Hollis asked. The single syllable carried the weight of a loaded weapon. Dr. Mercer looked up at the giant standing before him. He was acutely aware of every scarred, tattooed, leather-clad man in the room staring at him with an intensity that bordered on physical force. He took a breath. "She flatlined twice," Dr. Mercer said. His voice was tired but steady. "She lost nearly 40% of her total blood volume. The knife lacerated a major venous tributary and nicked the colon. The damage was extensive." Wren had woken. She was sitting upright in the chair, her hands gripping the armrests, her face white. Dr. Mercer continued. He looked directly into Hollis Kincaid's dark, burning eyes. "The hemostatic packing your medic applied in the field saved her life. Without it, she would have bled out within 30 minutes of the wound. I was able to graft the damaged vein and repair the secondary lacerations. She is in a medically induced coma to allow her body to begin healing. The next 48 hours are critical." He paused. "But the girl is a fighter. I have never seen a patient with that level of blood loss maintain consciousness for as long as she did. She held on far longer than physiology says she should have." He allowed himself a small, exhausted nod. "She is going to live." The sound that moved through the waiting room was not a cheer. It was a collective exhale. a simultaneous release of held breath from 24 men who had been carrying the weight of a stranger's life on their shoulders since before dawn. Some looked at the ceiling, some looked at the floor. Several turned away, raising calloused hands to their faces in gestures that they would later deny were anything other than rubbing tired eyes. Hollis Kincaid reached out and took Dr. Mercer's hand. The doctor's hand disappeared inside the biker's massive grip. The handshake was firm but careful, calibrated with a gentleness that belied the violence those hands were capable of. "You just bought this hospital whatever it needs, Doc," Hollis said. His voice was rough, the edges worn down by hours of fear and silence. "Equipment, supplies, staff. You write the list. The wolves will cover it." Dr. Mercer blinked. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He nodded. Wren was on her feet. She crossed the room and stood beside her father, looking up at the doctor with eyes that were red-rimmed and swollen, but burning with a fierce, luminous hope. "Can I see her?" Wren asked. "When she wakes up, can I be there?" Dr. Mercer looked at the 16-year-old girl covered in dried blood and engine grease, and something in his clinical detachment softened. "She won't be awake for a while. But yes, you can sit with her." The emergency room doors opened again before anyone could move. Declan Holt walked in. His lean frame moved with quiet purpose through the crowd of bikers who parted for him without being asked. Behind him, supported gently on each side by 2 Iron Wolves members who handled her as though she were made of porcelain, was a small, frail woman in a faded floral nightgown and an oversized coat that had been draped around her shoulders. Dorothea Whitlow. She was trembling, not from the cold of the air-conditioned hospital, but from the deep cellular tremor of a mother who had been woken before dawn by strangers in leather and told that her daughter was in surgery with a knife wound. Her eyes were wide and glassy, taking in the scene before her, with the disoriented bewilderment of someone who has been dropped into a world that operates by rules she does not understand. She saw the bikers, dozens of them, huge, scarred, tattooed men who filled the waiting room like boulders in a riverbed. Men who looked like they could tear the building down with their bare hands. Every single one of them stood aside for her. They moved without being told, pressing against the walls, creating a wide, clear path from the entrance to the center of the room. Some removed their hats. Some lowered their eyes. The respect was instinctive, unanimous, and absolute. Hollis saw her. He moved immediately. He crossed the room, and as he approached, he reached behind him and took his leather president's cut from the chair where it hung. He folded it deliberately and carefully and tucked it under his arm. When he stood before Dorothea Whitlow, he was not the president of the Iron Wolves. He was not iron. He was just a man, a father, speaking to a mother. He took her small, trembling hands in his own. His scarred, enormous hands swallowed hers, completely enveloping them with a warmth and gentleness that seemed impossible from a man of his size and reputation. "Mrs. Whitlow," Hollis said. His voice was soft, softer than anyone in that room had ever heard it. Stripped of command and authority and menace, it carried nothing but a raw, unguarded reverence that made several of the hardened men in the room look away. "My name is Hollis. Your daughter saved my little girl's life tonight. 3 armed men came for my Wren, and your Jessamine stood between them and my daughter, with a tire iron in her hands, and absolutely no reason to risk her own life except that you raised her to be the kind of person who doesn't walk away." Dorothea's chin trembled. A tear slid down her thin, pale cheek. "She's the bravest person I have ever met." Hollis continued, "And I have known a great many brave people. She is alive. She is going to recover. And as long as I have breath in my lungs, Mrs. Whitlow, your family will never want for anything again. I give you my word." Dorothea Whitlow looked up at the giant biker. She studied his face, the scars, the dark eyes, the weight of violence and command that hung on him like gravity. And then she looked past him at the room full of men who had ridden through the desert night to save a girl they had never met. Take me to my daughter, Dorothea whispered. Please. Hollis nodded. He released one of her hands, but kept the other, and he walked her personally through the double doors of the surgical wing, matching his massive stride to her small, slow, careful steps. Wren followed 2 paces behind. She carried a white bakery box she had sent one of the bikers to find at 4 in the morning when the nearest open bakery was 37 miles away in Fallon. The box contained 1 dozen snickerdoodles. Waking up from a medically induced coma is not the dramatic gasping return to consciousness that movies portray. It is a slow, heavy, agonizing crawl through layers of chemical fog, like swimming upward through dark water toward a light that keeps receding. For Jessamine Whitlow, consciousness returned in fragments. The rhythmic electronic beep of a heart monitor. Steady now, stable. A sound so clean and precise that it seemed to belong to a different universe than the wet, ragged gasping that had filled the Texaco garage. The sharp antiseptic smell of iodine and sterile gauze. The stiff, scratchy texture of hospital sheets against her skin. A deep, heavy pulling ache in her left side that throbbed with each breath but no longer screamed. The pain had been tamed, leashed, reduced from a wild consuming fire to a dull, manageable coal. She managed to open her eyes. The ICU room was small and quiet, lit by the soft glow of monitoring equipment, and the thin gray light of early morning filtering through slatted blinds. Tubes ran from her arms to IV bags hanging on a chrome stand. Wires connected her chest to the heart monitor. A nasal cannula delivered a steady flow of oxygen. The first thing she saw was her mother. Dorothea Whitlow was asleep in a plush recliner that had been pulled close to the bed. It was not a hospital recliner. It was new, upholstered in soft leather, and it looked wildly out of place in the sterile institutional room. Someone had brought it in specifically for her. Dorothea's head rested against the wing of the chair, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing slow and even, deep. Jess stared at her mother for a long time. Something was different. The dark bruised circles that had permanently shadowed Dorothea's eyes for the past 2 years were lighter. Her skin, usually carrying a grayish pallor that spoke of poor circulation and chronic fluid retention, had a faint warm tint that Jess had not seen in months. Her breathing, normally accompanied by the faint wet rattle that Jess monitored with obsessive vigilance, was smooth, quiet, unlabored. She looked rested. Jess tried to speak. Her throat felt like it had been packed with sand and broken glass. She managed a dry, rasping cough that tore through the silence of the room. Dorothea's eyes opened instantly, the reflex of a nurse, even in sleep, responding to a patient's distress. For a moment, she simply stared at her daughter, her expression frozen in the suspended disbelief of someone who has been holding their breath for so long they have forgotten what breathing feels like. Then her face crumpled. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against Jess's shoulder with infinite care, mindful of the tubes and wires, and wept. "You're awake?" Dorothea whispered. "Oh, Jess, you scared me. You absolutely terrified me." "Mom." Jess's voice was barely a scratch of sound. She swallowed painfully. "Are you okay? You're breathing. It sounds different." Dorothea pulled back. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and then she smiled. Not the thin, effortful smile that Jess had grown accustomed to, the one that required visible energy to produce and faded quickly. This was a real smile, full and warm and reaching all the way to her eyes. "I'm fine, baby. Better than fine. You just rest. Everything is taken care of." Before Jess could ask what that meant, the heavy door of the ICU room opened with a soft click. Hollis Kincaid stepped into the room. He wore a clean black t-shirt and dark jeans. His leather cut the one bearing the president's patch, and the snarling wolf was not on his body. He had left it outside the room, deliberately folded on a chair in the hallway, out of respect for Dorothea. Without it, he looked almost ordinary. Almost. The scars and the shoulders and the gravitational presence were harder to disguise. Wren followed him. She carried the white bakery box in both hands, holding it in front of her like an offering. Jess's heart monitor registered a spike, a sharp upward blip that drew a brief glance from the nurse monitoring the station outside. The memories of the Texaco station, the knife, the garage, the blinding wall of headlights, the sound of 200 engines. All of it came flooding back in a disordered rush that made her grip the bed rails until her knuckles whitened. Hollis saw the spike. He stopped at the foot of the bed. He kept his distance. His hands hung at his sides, open and visible palms forward. "Easy," Hollis said. His voice was remarkably gentle. Coming from a man of his size and reputation, the gentleness was almost more startling than the authority. "You're safe. Nobody in this building is going to hurt you. In fact, there are currently 40 of my guys rotating shifts in the lobby and the parking lot. You are quite possibly the most heavily guarded patient in the state of Nevada right now." Jess looked at him, then at Wren, the girl who had held pressure on her wound for 2 hours, who had climbed into a filthy oil pit to stay alive, who had promised her snickerdoodles. Wren stepped forward. She placed the white bakery box on the bedside table and opened the lid. Inside, arranged in neat rows on wax paper, were 12 golden brown snickerdoodles dusted with cinnamon sugar. The smell rose from the box and filled the small room warm and sweet and achingly domestic. "You told me your mom likes to bake these," Wren said. Her voice wobbled but held. "Hospital food is terrible. I know these aren't your mom's recipe, but I promised we'd share a dozen, and I don't break promises." Jess felt something hot and tight build behind her eyes. She blinked. A tear escaped and tracked slowly down her cheek, disappearing into the pillow. "Thank you," Jess whispered. Hollis moved to the side of the bed opposite Dorothea. He stood there for a moment, looking down at Jess with an expression that contained respect, gratitude, and something deeper. Something that looked almost like humility, which seemed impossible on a face designed for command and intimidation. "Doctor," "Mercer says you have a long road ahead," Hollis began. His tone was direct and serious, but not unkind. "You took a hit that would have killed grown men with twice your body weight. The blade missed your lung by the width of a thread. Your heart stopped twice on the operating table. Twice. And both times it started again." He paused, letting the weight of that settle. "I don't have the words to properly thank you for what you did for my daughter. In my world, words are cheap anyway. They're easy to say and easier to break. Actions are what matter. Actions are the only currency that holds its value." Hollis reached into the back pocket of his jeans and produced a thick sealed manila envelope. He placed it on the bed beside Jess's hand. "What is this?" Jess asked, her brow furrowing. "That but," Hollis answered, "is the deed to your house, paid in full. The mortgage is gone. There are also documents in there establishing a trust in your name. It will cover your college tuition wherever you choose to go and provide a monthly stipend so that you never have to work another graveyard shift at a gas station for the rest of your life." Jess stared at the envelope. She did not touch it. "And your mother?" Hollis looked at Dorothea, who was sitting very still in her leather recliner, her hands pressed flat against her thighs, her eyes glistening. "Yesterday morning, my vice president made some calls. A top-tier cardiovascular specialist was flown in from Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles. He reviewed your mother's charts last night. She has been moved to the top of the transplant waiting list. The Iron Wolves are covering every medical expense, the evaluations, the surgery when a heart becomes available, the aftercare, the medications, all of it, for as long as it takes." The room was very quiet. The heart monitor beeped its steady, reassuring rhythm. The oxygen hissed softly through the nasal cannula. Outside the window, the thin light of a Nevada morning crept across the parking lot, painting the rows of silent motorcycles in shades of gold and amber. Jess felt a tear roll down her other cheek, then another. She had fought so hard for so long. She had hauled scrap metal in 100-degree heat. She had worked midnight shifts on 3 hours of sleep. She had counted pills and rationed groceries, and sat beside her mother's bed in the dark, counting the seconds between each breath, terrified that the next gap would be the last one. The weight of it, the enormous, crushing, suffocating weight of trying to hold the world together with her bare hands at 17 years old. And now, because of one decision made in the space between heartbeats on a gas station floor, the weight was being lifted. "I can't take this," Jess said, her voice cracked. She looked at the envelope, then at Hollis, then at her mother. "Mr. Kincaid, this is too much. I just did what anyone should have done." Hollis shook his head slowly. "No, Jess, you didn't. Most people in that situation would have told Wade Harmon exactly where my daughter was hiding and saved their own skin. Nobody would have blamed them. Self-preservation is the most natural instinct a human being has. You overrode it. You overrode it for a stranger. For a girl you had never met wearing colors you had every reason to be afraid of." His dark eyes held hers. There was no pressure in them, no demand, just a steady, patient certainty. "I've been in this life for 30 years, Hollis continued. I've seen men with guns and patches and reputations run from fights that mattered. And I watched a 17-year-old girl with a tire iron stand her ground against 3 armed men because her mother taught her that you don't turn your back. That is the rarest thing I have ever seen, and it deserves to be honored." He paused. "As for the men who did this to you," Hollis's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Wade Harmon and his associate have decided to leave the state permanently. You will not see them again. You will not hear from them. The desert is very large and it keeps its secrets." The implication hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Jess did not ask for details. She understood. She had grown up in Ridgestone. She knew how the desert worked. Jess looked at the envelope on her bed. She looked at her mother, who was watching her with an expression that contained a lifetime of exhaustion and hope braided together so tightly they were indistinguishable. "Mom," Jess whispered. Dorothea reached across the bed and took her daughter's hand. Her grip was gentle but firm, the grip of a woman who had spent 22 years holding the hands of frightened patients and telling them that everything was going to be all right. "Take it, Jessamine," Dorothea said softly. "This isn't charity. This is a man paying a debt. And in my experience, the best thing you can do when someone offers you help with a sincere heart is to let them give it." Jess held her mother's gaze for a long moment. Then she looked at Hollis. "I want you to know something," Jess said. Her voice was thin but clear. "I'm grateful, more grateful than I know how to say, but I'm not joining your club. I'm not riding with you. I'm going to go to college and I'm going to take care of my mom and I'm going to live a regular life." A silence filled the room. Wren glanced at her father, uncertain. Hollis Kincaid looked at the 17-year-old girl lying in a hospital bed, connected to machines that were keeping her alive, covered in bandages, that told the story of a violence she had walked into with open eyes. He looked at the stubborn, clear-eyed defiance in her gaze, the same defiance that had made her stand in front of a knife for a stranger. And for the first time in a very long time, Hollis Kincaid smiled. It was not a large smile. It was not a warm smile in the conventional sense. It was a small, rare, genuine expression that cracked the granite of his face and revealed for just a moment the human being beneath the legend. "I'm not recruiting you, Jess," Hollis said. "I'm not offering you a patch. I'm paying a blood debt. You bled for my family. That makes you family, not a member, not a rider, family. And family takes care of their own. That is the beginning and the end of it." He stepped back from the bed. He nodded once to Dorothea, a deep, respectful inclination of his head that carried more courtesy than 1,000 spoken words. Then he turned and walked toward the door. "Mr. Kincaid," Jess called after him. Hollis stopped. He looked back over his shoulder. "Thank you," Jess said simply. Hollis held her gaze for a moment. Then he walked through the door and closed it softly behind him. Wren remained. She stood beside the bed looking down at Jess with an expression that held gratitude, relief, guilt, and the fragile tentative beginning of something that might in time grow into a deep and lasting friendship. "He means it, you know," Wren said quietly. "Everything he said. My dad doesn't say things he doesn't mean. It's his best quality and his most terrifying one." Jess managed a weak smile. "I figured." Wren was quiet for a moment. She looked down at her hands at the faint rust-colored stains that still clung to the creases of her knuckles, despite repeated scrubbing. "Jess," Wren said. Her voice was smaller now, younger, stripped of the fierce command she had forged in the garage, leaving behind the 16-year-old girl underneath. "I need to say something to you, and I need you to hear it." Jess waited. "I'm sorry." Wren's eyes filled. She blinked rapidly, but the tears came anyway, sliding down her cheeks in quiet, steady streams. "I'm sorry I brought this to your door. I'm sorry I ran into your gas station instead of into the desert. I'm sorry you're lying in this bed with a hole in your side because of me. I will carry that for the rest of my life." Jess reached out. The movement sent a dull flare of pain through her abdomen, but she reached anyway. Her fingers still pale and cold, but no longer carrying the terrifying blue tint of a body emptied of blood, found Wren's hand and squeezed it. "You already said that in the garage," Jess said. "And I already told you. Not your fault. Not then. Not now. Not ever." Wren let out a shuddering breath. She wiped her eyes with her free hand. "You're annoyingly stubborn, you know that." Wren said, a watery half-laugh escaping despite herself. "My mom says the same thing." Wren reached into the bakery box and pulled out a snickerdoodle. She broke it carefully in half, the golden cookie crumbling slightly at the edges, releasing a fresh wave of cinnamon into the sterile hospital air. She placed one half on Jess's bedside table within easy reach. She bit into the other half. "Deal's a deal," Wren said, chewing slowly. A small, real, uncomplicated smile crossed her face for the first time in what felt like forever. "They're not as good as your mom's, but they'll do." Dorothea laughed, a genuine surprised laugh that seemed to startle even her. It was a sound that Jess had not heard in a very long time, and it filled the small hospital room with something that no medical equipment could measure and no prescription could provide. Jess let her head sink into the pillows. The exhaustion was immense, pressing down on her from every direction. But for the first time in years, the exhaustion was not accompanied by fear. Not accompanied by the grinding, relentless anxiety of wondering how the next bill would be paid, whether the prescription would be filled, whether her mother would still be breathing when she checked on her at 3 in the morning. She looked at Dorothea breathing easily in the new leather recliner. She looked at Wren eating a snickerdoodle with quiet contentment. She felt the steady, reassuring pulse of the heart monitor, each beep a small electronic promise that she was still here, still alive, still in the fight. Outside the window, the morning sun climbed higher over Ridgestone. The parking lot of the hospital was still full of motorcycles. Bikers sat in small groups drinking coffee from paper cups, talking in low voices. A shift change was occurring, fresh riders arriving to relieve the overnight watch. They moved quietly, respectfully, with a discipline that belied their rough appearance. Jess closed her eyes. The last thing she heard before sleep pulled her gently under was the distant sound of a motorcycle engine starting in the parking lot below. A single deep rumble that vibrated through the window glass and settled into her chest like a second heartbeat. The sound of a guardian who had no intention of leaving. Dawn had come to Ridgestone, Nevada, not with the gentle chorus of morning birds, but with the lingering echo of 200 engines and the metallic scent of dried blood, and the quiet, ferocious loyalty of men who lived outside the law, but understood in their scarred and battered hearts that some debts are paid not with money or violence, but with presence, with vigilance, with the simple, profound act of standing watch over someone who had earned it. Jessamine Whitlow had earned it. She had earned it with a tire iron and a split-second decision, and the words of a sick woman sitting at a kitchen table rolling snickerdoodle dough with trembling hands. You don't ever turn your back when somebody needs you. Jess hadn't turned her back. She had turned to face the knife. And the knife had opened a door to a world she never expected to enter, and a family she never expected to find. She slept deeply, peacefully, the deepest sleep she had known since she was a child, before the bills and the prescriptions and the midnight shifts and the constant exhausting arithmetic of survival. The heart monitor beeped on, steady and strong and unwavering, and in the parking lot below, the Iron Wolves kept watch.